Tick-tock, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the world. Your friendly neighborhood philosopher here, D. Wood. With me now is Ehteshaam. Gulam, how you doing?
I doing good. You?
Yeah,
I
hey, we've known each other for a long time, haven't we?
yeah, 14 years. 14 years. Can you believe that?
That's a long time.
There's a long time. Yep.
Yeah, so
Before
I've known.
before
Oh, good.
before my job, before Ali Dawa, before I was way before those guys.
Yeah, I've known you a lot longer than I've known most of my friends right now. So yeah, we go way back, and we debated. When was that? 2010, 2009, somewhere in there.
2009. Yeah, I remember that. That was wow, that was 14 years ago. Wow.
Long time ago. Um, but yeah, so why don't you go ahead and before we get started, and guys, we're going to keep this. We're not going to be very strict about time. We're going to keep it kind of organized and not arguing. We'll probably take, yeah, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 minutes or something each at the beginning to sort of lay out our general thoughts on the crucifixion of Jesus, and then we'll just keep it friendly discussion format. But here, before we get started, I want you give everyone a little introduction to yourself and what you do on your channel.
Oh, okay. For those of you who don't know me, in case you're not familiar with me, my name is Ehteshaam Gulam. I've been a Muslim apologist for, I don't know, like over 15 years now. It's been over like 15 years. I was before Mohammed Hijab, before Ali Dawa. I was before all those guys. I was before YouTube. I think I before YouTube. I think I was before YouTube. So I'm way old school. Like me and Ma and J, or the Muslim apologists, started at the same time. So we're way before like YouTube and all that. So yeah, my name's Ehteshaam Gulam. You probably seen my debates with Sam Shamoun and all those people. I'm a Muslim apologist, as I've said. I'm a big comic book fan, as David Wood probably knows. I'm a big comic book fan. See my Batman shirt right there. I was a DC fan, but right now I'm playing. Right now I'm playing Spider-Man 2. So this game's pretty cool. So yeah, I'm a big comic book fan. I probably know more about Marvel and DC than religion, as I hate to admit it, but that's true. So I'm a big comic book fan. I'm a big Marvel DC fan and stuff like that. And I've been Muslim apologist for a long time. And my YouTube page should be in the description below. Answering Christians One. And I'm also friends with a lot of people like Bart Ehrman, Richard Carrier, Robert M. Price. I'm friends with those atheist scholars of the New Testament and things like that. But I never got Ehrman on my channel because it's not going to go well if I have him on my channel. So but I'm friends with Ehrman. I talk to him a lot on email and stuff like that. So me and David Wood, we know the same people, and we're in contact with the same people, I guess. If you want to go into that atheist realm or atheistic scholar. So yeah, I work at a hospital. I got my bachelor's and master's from Wayne State University. So I work at a hospital right now, and I actually got promoted last month to hospital administrator. So now I have more responsibilities. So I can't be playing video games and reading comics that much anymore. But I always love doing this stuff in my spare time. So yeah, that's your friendly neighborhood Muslim apologist edition.
All right, so we one of the main dividing issues between Christians and Muslims is Jesus' death by crucifixion and what actually happened. We have, interestingly, some similarities with Muslims, like believing that God created the universe and that God has sent revelations and prophets. Even on Jesus, we agree that he was born of a virgin, that he performed all kinds of miracles, that he's the Messiah. And so we have these kinds of disagreements, and it's just interesting. You get to the crucifixion of Jesus because here's an issue where where lots of people actually agree, scholars from pretty much across the spectrum. So whether they're Christian scholars, liberal Christian scholars, conservative Christian scholars, atheist scholars, occasional Jewish scholars talk about this. But pretty much across the board, everyone agrees that Jesus' death by crucifixion is a fact of history, and then the question becomes, what do you do with it? If you're an atheist, you say, okay, he's just another one of the thousands and thousands of crucifixion victims during the Roman Empire. Christians take it to be part of God's plan as a core feature of salvation and so on. And so it's just interesting that this is an area where Islam apparently disagrees with, at least in its most prominent forms. There are some minority positions that we can maybe we'll talk about here in a little bit. But so as far as the matter of fact, let me just go ahead and quote some various scholars on this. Of course, it's quoting non-Christian scholars here just because I don't want people. What's that?
Are you citing atheist scholars?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah, go ahead. Then I'll respond to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. Just is just the beginning. So I'm going to take I'll take a few minutes to sort of just introduce my position, and then you could take 5 to 10 minutes. No, you're no problem. No, matter of fact, if you want to interrupt me, I don't care. So we have Christians obviously agree that Jesus died by crucifixion, but even there are New Testament scholars and historical Jesus scholars who are not Christians or who are very liberal Christians. So there are atheist New Testament scholars and historical Jesus scholars. There are agnostic New Testament and historical Jesus scholars. And it's interesting because some of the atheist and agnostic and Jewish scholars just regard this as an indisputable fact of history. So atheist New Testament scholar Gerrit Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. That's pretty strong language for a historian, right? Because like you're looking at documents and so on from many centuries ago. He says it's indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, says that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. If we know anything about Jesus, we know that he was executed. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid says that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. Paula Fredrickson, she's a convert to Judaism. She says the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And of course, Bart Ehrman maintains one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So again, this Bart Ehrman saying one of the most certain facts of history. So they obviously believe that there's quite a bit of evidence that Jesus was crucified. And so this is going to come down to various sources that we have, even for people who think that Christians were making up lots of stuff back then. It's understood if you were going to make something up to convince people that your guy is the Messiah, saying that he was crucified would probably not be something that you would make up. So there's no reason to make up a story about that. And the sources agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Scholars agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. There are theories about how he might have survived. These ideas are usually based on not understanding how crucifixion works. It's a pretty artwork usually doesn't do the slightest bit of justice. So you'll have Jesus and he'll have some blood coming out of his hands or wrists or something like this. Actual crucifixion, they would lash you with a flagrum, and that was sort of a whip with lots of tails, cat of nine tails, with chunks of bone and metal woven into the strands. It was designed to rip flesh. So if they hit you with it, it would sort of stick to your skin. Chunks of metal would go in, and then they would rip it out. This was meant to weaken you. They didn't want to be trying to nail some 25-year-old strapping young lad who rebelled against the empire. They didn't want to be sitting there struggling with him on the ground trying to nail this guy to a cross. Just the beating by itself was sometimes called the half death because victims would be half dead by the time the beating was finished. So after the beating, after they lashed you to a bloody mess, leaving your skin on your back hanging like ribbons, leaving your arteries and veins exposed. We actually have sources on people's intestines spilling out just from the beating itself. I think it was around a quarter. It was around a quarter of people died just from the beating. So that's prior to even being nailed to the cross. People are dying, and then they nail you to a cross anyways, as an example. But so it's a horrible, bloody process even before you are put on the cross, and then of course you're nailed to a cross. And if you hang in that position for a long time with your arms outstretched like that, and all your body weight isn't, that's why they put the nail through your heels. If they just left you dangling, it would become harder and harder for you to breathe. And as you lost blood, you're just going to die more quickly. So they put the nail through the heels, and there are variations. They could tie your feet if they wanted to, but they put a nail through your heels so that as you're running out of breath, you will actually just you'll be starving for oxygen. You will actually push yourself up to exhale, because when your arms are outstretched and your body weight's hanging on it, your muscles eventually start to give out, and your chest cavity is fully expanded. Your chest cavity is fully expanded, and it becomes very hard to exhale. So your breathing becomes very difficult, and so you push up just so you can breathe out, and then you can breathe back in. Anyway, it was a very well-developed method of execution, and extremely brutal. And so, from the perspective of a historian, if you say so-and-so was crucified, well, that obviously means that someone died there. And so we've got the sources that talk about, Christian sources, Jewish sources, Roman sources, talking about Jesus' crucifixion. We've got a historical consensus on Jesus' death by crucifixion. And eventually we get to some alternative theories. It's interesting where these alternative theories come from. There were some groups, the Docetists and the Gnostics, who believed that Jesus was just a divine figure. He wasn't actually a human being. So if you got Jesus, and as Christians believe he's the incarnate Son, there are two basic directions you can veer from that. You could say he was just human being, or you could say he was just some divine figure. The question for the Gnostics and the Docetists who held that position then became, well, if Jesus didn't actually have a human body, if he wasn't actually a human being, how could he have died by crucifixion? And then they had to come up with some explanations, and they started coming up with explanations like maybe someone else was disguised to make him look like Jesus, and this other person was crucified in Jesus' place. And so it's interesting that eventually became the most popular understanding in Islam. I say it's interesting because we know where the theory came from. And where the theory came from was from people who were trying to explain how...
Can you just give me 1 minute? Just 1 second.
Sure, no problem. Hey, Ehteshaam, can I keep talking though?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there. Yeah, so I'll just wrap up here. So...
yeah, I'm sorry. My parents are visiting, and you know how it is.
Oh, you're good. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah, the Docetists and the Gnostics. So
the substitution theory.
Yeah. So we know where the theory came from, and it's just fascinating that the theory came from people who believed that Jesus wasn't human, and so the idea that this took off in Islam eventually as the dominant theory is interesting because we know where the theory came from, and most Muslims that I talk to think that is the correct view according to the Quran. I have sort of changed my views on that over time. Right now I'm kind of like 50-50 on whether the Quran is even... Well, I'm kind of 50-50 on whether the Quran is saying that Jesus didn't die. I'm kind of 50-50 on that. And on the issue of whether the Quran is actually promoting substitution theory...
I'll explain.
That's fine. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up. As far as what I believe about what the Quran is saying, so now I'm like 50-50 on whether the Quran is even denying that Jesus died by crucifixion, and I'm at like 20 to 30% on whether the Quran is advocating substitution theory. That's what you find in the Muslim commentaries later on, and that became the dominant view. The Quran isn't exactly clear on what it's talking about. And so that's just kind of an overview to set up the discussion. But now, Ehteshaam, if you want to take 5 or 10 minutes and just give your kind of overview on all of these issues, and then we can discuss things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that so here's where I agree with David Wood. I agree that Jesus was crucified. Like, and if that's blowing Muslims' mind, let me explain here. The Quran says, well, let me read the Quranic verse. Let me just read the Quran. It says, it's talking about. Let's get to the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 is what we're talking about here. We're talking about one Quranic verse, and possibly another Quranic verse is the Quran chapter 3 verse 55, where Allah says, "Oh Jesus, I'll take you and I'll raise you to myself." Now, I've seen David Wood's videos and I've responded to it on my channel. But the Quran chapter 4 verse 157, let me just begin there. It says, the Jews said, "We killed Jesus, the Christ, the son of Mary." But the Quran says they didn't kill him, nor did they crucify him. It was made to appear to them, and those who differ follow nothing but conjecture and guesswork. But surely they killed him not. And the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 ends with, they killed him not. And the next verse says, Allah raised him to himself. Now, here's where I disagree with classical Muslim commentaries, and I'll explain why I disagree. Now, notice what the Quran says. It says, it was made to appear to them. It was made to appear to them. Even if you read it in Arabic, it was made to appear to them does not mean somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. If you read the Quran chapter 5, verse 33, the Quran mentions crucifixion as death, like death on the cross. By the method of crucifixion, the Quran is saying saying that Jesus was not killed by the method of crucifixion. You see what I'm saying? So what these early Muslim scholars like Ibn Kathir, Ibn Abbas, Al-Jalalain, etc., why they said somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus, even though there's no evidence for that in the first century, in the New Testament, is because they took an extremely literal view of that Quranic verse. It was made to appear to them. They thought that Jesus wasn't even crucified, that somebody else had to have been crucified, because they didn't know how to make sense of that Quranic passage other than their extreme literal view of that passage. So I think David Wood is right when he says it possibly comes from the Basilians or the Docetics, the Docetic, an early Christian group that said Jesus was so divine he couldn't be crucified to begin with. I think that's where it comes from. But there's a really good book which Shabir Ali mentions. It's called Christ in Islam by Neil Robinson, and he traces the so-called substitution theory to northern Iraq in the 2nd century. Those stories came from northern Iraq in, I believe, the 8th century or something. So the Quran never says somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. The Prophet Muhammad never said somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. So that view that somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus, although it's found in Ibn Kathir and Ibn Abbas and all that, they took an extremely literal view, but that's not what the Quran is saying. The Quran says it was made to appear to them. So my view that I've always held on to, and I've said this in my debate with you years ago and with Mary Jo Sharp, is that Jesus was crucified, but he survived the crucifixion. That is what I think the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 is talking about there. And Shabir Ali holds this view. The late Ahmadidat also hold this view, even though he is a controversial Muslim preacher. I don't think Zakir Naik holds this view. I don't believe so, but or I think Zakir Naik does hold it, but he says it's not the correct Islamic interpretation. So let's just go. So me and Shabir Ali agree that Jesus was crucified. I think that's certain. Now, Muslims will disagree with us. Muslims will disagree with me. Muslims have disagreed with me on my channel, but I think the evidence is very strong that Jesus was crucified on the cross. So David Wood wants to hammer that point, or he wants to, say that's historical, that Jesus was crucified. I agree, Jesus was crucified. I think that's the best. It's verified by the New Testament, Josephus, Tacitus, whatever. So my view is that Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die on the cross. Now, David Wood cited how many atheist scholars did you cite, David? 5 or 6 or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so he cites atheist scholars Gerd Luderman, Bart Ehrman, Paula Fredrickson, if I'm remembering correctly. So the reason why atheists say that Jesus was crucified is because they don't believe in the supernatural, right? So if a man lived 2,000 years ago and he's crucified, given their atheistic, anti-supernatural, liberal views, of course they're going to say he died on the cross. Because if a man lived 2,000 years ago and he's crucified, given their atheistic views, of course they're going to say he died. Of course, like like that. That's just their atheistic or humanistic approach to things. But I think David was being inconsistent here. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the atheists, like I said, don't believe in the supernatural. So of course they're going to say Jesus died 2,000 years ago. They're going to say that. But the problem is David Wood, as a theist, as a Christian, believes in the supernatural. He believes in miracles. He believes in the virgin birth. He believes that God split the sea for Moses. He believes that Elijah went to heaven without dying. He believes in the Old Testament story of Enoch going to heaven without dying. So I think David Wood is being inconsistent here because he does believe in the supernatural. But when he's citing these atheist scholars, of course they're going to say Jesus died on the cross. Because if a man lived 2,000 years ago and given atheistic views, if he's crucified and given their anti-supernatural views, of course they're going to say, he died on the cross. Of course they're going to say that. I mean, why wouldn't they say that? Christians also have a theological view. I saw one of David Wood's videos. I think it's "How Can God Die" or something like that. I responded to it on my channel, and my view is that, of course, Christians are going to say Jesus died too. It's because they have a theological reason for believing it. But and then David Wood cites the criteria of embarrassment. I took some notes here, and this criteria doesn't work either because, of course, people are going to make up non-flattering stories about Jesus, about the Prophet Muhammad after they died for political reasons, sectarian reasons, theological reasons, you name it. The criteria of embarrassment does not work, in proving Jesus died on the cross or trying to show that the gospel writers didn't have motive to invent something like that. So my view is that Jesus was crucified, but he survived. And atheists and Christians can't disprove my view because my view is a supernatural or theological view. Why can't God keep Jesus alive? That's certainly possible. Given my theological view. So I think Christians are inconsistent when they criticize the swoon theory or the theory that Jesus was crucified and he survived. Yeah, Dave, if you wanna respond, or if you want me to keep going.
Yeah, couple of issues there. So I'll go ahead and respond to those those points you just made, and then I'd like to bring up the passages, but just because there will be people. There are always people who are kind of new to this, so they don't even understand. They don't understand what we're talking about. We're talking about Surah 4, verse 157. So we'll actually pull the verses up on the screen, and so we can
Go ahead.
yeah, we can break down what we mean here. So as far as now, let me say here at the beginning, as far as Ehteshaam saying that we believe in the supernatural, so we believe that God could miraculously keep someone alive, even a victim of crucifixion. Absolutely, totally agree with him on that. God could have someone go through 1,000 crucifixions and survive. We're talking about God here. Of course, God could do that. The question is, why would we believe something like that? Why would we believe that God had Jesus crucified or allowed him to be crucified, but then miraculously sustained him throughout that so that he actually survived? So that's a
If I can interject just for one quick second. If you read the Old Testament, like when I read the Bible, people survived, or God saved people. God saved Jonah, and I know Christians have responded to the sign of Jonah argument, but God, saved Jonah. God, according to the Bible, Yahweh Elohim, whatever God's name is, he saved what do you call it, Enoch, or he raised Enoch to himself. Elijah was saved. So these people were saved. So why can't the same thing be done with Jesus? Like the New Testament uses the Old Testament, to prove various things Jesus said, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just my view, is that why can't God do the same for Jesus?
yes, yeah. So Yeah, again, no disagreement between us there. As far as if we're talking about the supernatural, yes, Elvis could still be alive, preserved somewhere by God. Tupac could still be alive, preserved somewhere by God. All these things are eminently possible. The question is, why would we believe them? So, if someone wanted to say, "I believe that Tupac is still alive," not just that it was some show or something like this or some conspiracy, but that actually, nope, he guys unloaded bullets into him, and then God miraculously sustained him, and then kept him alive afterwards. Of course, God could do that. The question is, should we actually believe that God did do that? So, anyway, on the issue of being inconsistent.
You know what's funny? The Tupac has an album called Resurrection.
Yeah, there's a funny Chappelle skit about Tupac. You should check out if you haven't seen it. Yeah,
I loved it.
I wrote the song a long time ago. Yeah, that was good. Anyway, so as far as citing atheists, that's not the issue on citing atheists and Jewish scholars and so on. Of course, we have disagreements, but that's kind of the point. It's Christian scholars and Jewish scholars would disagree a lot on the life of Jesus. Christians and atheists would disagree a lot when it comes to the life of Jesus. But everyone across the board agrees that he died by crucifixion. And so it's a rare area where people agree. And so the point is not citing an atheist and therefore the atheist is right. I think the atheists are wrong about lots and lots of things, really, really important things. The point is that people who ordinarily disagree with us on all of these big issues, on this issue agree. And you're pointing out that, well, this is 2,000 years ago. And of course, if someone is crucified, the atheist is not going to assume that God is going to miraculously keep that person alive. You're right. That option wouldn't be open to them, just as Jesus rising from the dead, as Christians believe, would not be open to the atheist. So you and I, Ehteshaam, are in agreement that we sort of have a belief about what happened that is miraculous that atheists are going to object to. And yet, if there just weren't any evidence for Jesus' crucifixion, the atheists would not be agreeing with us and saying it's an indisputable fact. They'd say, how do we know what happened? It was a long time ago. We have no idea what happened. So anyway, the point is there's something here that is even convincing critical scholars like Bart Ehrman and so on that this is a fact of history. The Jesus seminar, they go kind of saying by saying and pick and choose what they believe, but they agree on this issue. And so it's just an interesting fact that people agree on this. As far as the criterion of embarrassment, that's just a situation of how do we account for the early belief in Jesus' death arising even among his followers, because his followers go to their horrible bloody deaths claiming that he died on the cross and rose from the dead. So
if I can interject.
Let me finish the point and then you can jump in. So the idea is these guys are first century Jews. First century Jews didn't really have a concept that the Messiah is going to come and die. That's why it kind of catches people off guard when Jesus dies. They didn't have really a concept of a dying Messiah, dying and rising Messiah. And so if you were a first century Jew and you wanted to come up with a story, that's the point of the principle of embarrassment. If you're going to invent something, you're going to invent something that helps your case. If you're a first century Jew trying to convince other first century Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, saying he died is not going to help your case. So why would you then invent it? It sounded like you were saying, well, people can sort of spread malicious stories about a person, like about Muhammad or about Jesus afterwards. But this isn't something that's coming along from some critics of Jesus later. I mean, of course, critics agree that he died. They would throw that in Christians' face. Come on, he's the Messiah. The guy got crucified. But that's the point. Everyone's agreeing. It's the Christians saying he was crucified, and there's a point to it. And there's the critics saying he was crucified, and this exposes him. What the underlying agreement among everyone is that he was crucified. So if he wasn't crucified, if Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, and the critics were to say, ha, 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 he got crucified, and he hadn't, the response of Jesus' followers and people who believed in Jesus would have been, "What are you talking about? He wasn't crucified." Or, "Yeah, he was crucified, but he was still around later. He survived it, and this shows that God was actually protecting him." That would have been a miraculous claim too. Saying that he miraculously survived this would have been a miracle claim too. So the point is, when you look at the evidence, just as far as what people are saying and what people are believing during that time, the critics of Christianity and the proponents of Christianity, and you say, how did these people come to these views? Well, a Jesus who didn't die on the cross kind of doesn't explain how these people came to believe these things. If there were, let me clarify that just to go along with what you were saying. If we wanted to say that Jesus was crucified but didn't die from the crucifixion, he was crucified but he didn't die, he survived by divine help. I think the only way to make sense of the evidence is even Jesus' own followers thought that he died, so God saved him, God miraculously saved him, but even Jesus' own followers were convinced that he died. And so it was kind of a secret until it would come along later. That's the only way that I could actually account for the evidence. And this is going to eventually lead into the questions about the character of God. If God is doing these things that are misleading all these people and leading all these people astray, and no one has any idea what happened, and then we get down to the present, and billions of people are convinced that Jesus died on the cross because Allah just didn't clarify what he was doing, we're going to have some issues there. But yeah, what are your thoughts on all this? Wait one second, because we are getting super chats. Let me just read these real quick, and then I would bring more shekels, but AP is not here. Yeah, this is a no atheist zone right now, ladies and gentlemen. We don't want atheists in here messing everything up. Sheikh Wingaling says, after constant bullying from D Wood, I have converted to Islam in order to justly get my revenge. That's Mike Winger there. Would not surprise me with Mike Winger. If Allah made them believe he was crucified, why did he lie about it? Happy Holy Week, everybody. Let me see. If Allah made them believe he was crucified, why did he have to lie about it?
You want me to respond?
Yeah, I don't fully understand the question, but if you get it, go ahead and respond.
Okay, well, you made up, you made a lot of assertions. Let me address those assertions, and then maybe I can address those questions or whatever. Well, you say that you talk about the disciples of Jesus, and I think that's an interesting point that you and Mike Licona brought up. I remember watching a debate with Mike Licona and Shabir Ali way back in 2005, 2004. Shabir Ali and Mike Licona. This was pre-YouTube. That's how old I am. I'm like pre-YouTube.
Yeah, I was at that debate.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah. Matter of fact, right before the debate, I took Shabir Ali. No one had any clue who I was back then, but Shabir Ali was coming to town, and The Passion of the Christ had just come out. I just messaged him and I said, hey, I don't know if this is going to come up in the debate, but it may come up in the Q&A since this is a popular movie right now. So you might want to go ahead and see it. And then he messaged me back and he said, no, I don't think I'll have a chance. I don't know if anyone's is going. And I said, I mean, I'll take you to see it. So I actually took Shabir to see The Passion of the Christ before the debate. So anyway, that was point was, that was way back in the day, ladies and gentlemen. This is right around the time The Passion of the Christ came out, which is before most of you who are watching this were even born. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you say that because after that debate, I saw Spider-Man 2, and there's this really good scene in Spider-Man 2. This is back in 2004. Passion and Spider-Man 2 came out.
Keep in mind, we're talking about the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man here, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we're talking about.
So anyways, there's this really good scene in Spider-Man 2 that reminds me of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, where Spider-Man, he's like Peter Parker, he takes off his mask, he's stopping the train. And
I remember that. Yeah.
It has like this really good Christ imagery on it. So I kind of made that connection where the Sam Raimi was making that Christ connection with Spider-Man and the Passion, or like Jesus symbolism. So I mean, I love Marvel movies and comic books. Like even before I got into this stuff. But anyways, getting to your point, what you saying about the disciples, and I remember Mike Lacona brought that point up with Shabir Ali, and I don't think Shabir Ali addressed that point because I think Mike Lacona he was onto something, but Shabir Ali didn't respond to it because of time restraints or whatever. But the problem with that claim is that with the disciples believing in Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, there's a serious problem. And the problem is that that claim is contingent, or that claim is dependent on the reliability of the New Testament, because we know Peter didn't write down anything. We know James didn't write down anything. We know that the other disciples, Andrew, etc., Bartholomew, they didn't write down anything. And I have this Bart Ehrman's forged right here. Now I know Bart Ehrman's an atheist. I know Christians don't like him. So basically, Ehrman in this book, Forged, talks about how Peter could not have written 1 Peter. He couldn't have written 2 Peter. It couldn't have possibly came from the disciples, because the disciples, according to Ehrman's view, spoke Aramaic, but the New Testament documents are written in Greek, sophisticated, like advanced college level Greek. So I think Ehrman has a good point there, that it's possible that the New Testament documents did not come from the disciples, but came from the second generation of believers, possibly Paul's followers, etc. So there's a serious problem with saying that the disciples believed in Jesus' death and resurrection, because first of all, the disciples didn't write down anything, and second of all, there's no evidence that the New Testament actually comes from the disciples. Then David Wood talks about, well, what about the disciples of Jesus going to their deaths for believing Jesus' death and resurrection? Well, there's a serious problem with that, because first of all, nowhere in the New Testament is there anything about anybody dying for their belief about Jesus' alleged death and resurrection. Nowhere in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts of the Apostles, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Revelation, etc., nowhere does it say that the disciples went and died for their belief. So the New Testament doesn't record any of that. The second problem is that these stories like Acts of Peter, where Peter is crucified upside down, etc., come from the late 2nd and 3rd century, years, I think like decades, years after the New Testament was written, like I think 180, 200 years after. So these legends of Jesus' disciples going to their deaths, allegedly going to their deaths, comes from these Gnostic or these New Testament apocryphal works that came years later. And, historians don't accept that. Like Ehrman doesn't accept that Jesus' disciples died, because he looked at the source and he says, well, they're all fanciful, legendary works. I think Mike Lacona, too, I believe that he talked about how those are unreliable records, Acts of Peter, Acts of John, where the disciples went to their deaths and stuff like that. So my point is that these are late records. So that view that the Jesus disciples believed that he died by the resurrection, or they believed in his death and resurrection, comes from the New Testament. And there's a serious problem, because if you read what conservative scholars say, Christian scholars like Raymond Brown, Bruce Metzger, Craig L. Blomberg, they say that the Gospels are anonymous, were written by anonymous Greek authors. So how can I trust people that we don't even know where they came from? Like Raymond Brown, Introduction to the New Testament, pages 158, 208, 267. The Gospels were anonymous, and later on, these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, were put in there in the 2nd century. Craig L. Blomberg, a conservative Christian, not an atheist, says that the Gospels are eternally anonymous. So there's a problem with David Wood's view that the disciples believe that that Jesus died by crucifixion and resurrection, because it comes from these unreliable documents. So David Wood's theory doesn't match up, or there's serious flaws in his view.
Quick question on those issues. So you're talking about these being based on unreliable sources, can't trust them, and yet here again we find non-Christians, atheists and atheist scholars and Jewish scholars agreeing with Christians on this point again. So Gerd Ludemann says it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So Gerrit Ludeman's an atheist. He doesn't believe that Jesus actually appeared. He says that it's historically certain that they were convinced that Jesus appeared to them somehow. And so as an atheist, there's a question of what you're going to do with that, describe it in terms of hallucinations or something like that. But they agree that the disciples must have had some sort of experiences that they're interpreting this way. Bart Ehrman says, we can say with complete certainty. I want to keep drawing attention to the language they're using when they're talking about the crucifixion. This is historically certain. This is indisputable, and so on. These are critics of Christianity. Gerrit Ludeman says it's historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman says we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Paula Fredrickson says, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know as a historian that they may have seen something. And they what's that?
Yeah, I mean, if I can interject here, right. If you read Gerrit Ludeman's book, Bart Ehrman's book, all those atheist scholars that you're just citing, they say Jesus came back as a vision. Because if you read 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 8, it says Jesus appeared to Paul the same way he appeared to Peter, James, etc., in the 12. So these atheists that you're citing say that Jesus came back as a vision, and that's something I agree with. And I'll get into that. I'll get into that right now. Is because what I think happened is that there's this really good book called Daniel A. Smith, The Empty Tomb, where Daniel A. Smith says that according to the Q Gospel, which predates Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which predates the New Testament documents, Daniel A. Smith argues that in the Q Gospel, it talks about Jesus' disappearance and not his resurrection. And the Q Gospel is early. It's earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So according to my view, is that when Jesus was crucified, he was taken down, he was put in the tomb, and from the tomb, he was taken into heaven. Because if you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. Nobody sees the resurrection. So I think that's a big problem for the resurrection narrative. If you want to comment on that.
No, I'm just saying, if someone had seen a vision, keep in mind, people back then did not have problems seeing visions. That's pretty normal. In fact, the reason that in the Gospels you see Jesus saying, "Hey, put your finger into my wound," and so on, is because that's exactly what someone would have thought. If you saw a guy get crucified, right? If crucifixion is a public event, someone dies, you find out the Romans crucified your guy. Guess what? You need to go find another guy because your guy's dead. If that guy were somehow to appear later on and you actually see him, no one is going to conclude resurrection. They're not going to conclude resurrection. They're going to conclude that this is some sort of vision or ghost or something like that. That's what they would conclude. No one's going to conclude resurrection unless they think it's actually a physical resurrection. So the disciples going out and maintaining that Jesus has been resurrected, that's a claim that his body has been raised. And so it's here again, we're left with the evidence and what explains the evidence. Well, if first century Jews are concluding that a man has been resurrected, and they're saying things like, "Wow, and we're going to be glorified, we're going to be resurrected like this," just seeing a vision or something like that doesn't really account for that. Now you're pointing out that that's a direction that atheists would have to go in. Why? Well, they don't actually believe in a resurrection. If you're an atheist and you believe, and Ehrman, I talked to Ehrman about this, and he agrees that Peter, Paul, and Mary, at the very least, all had to believe that they were seeing the risen Jesus.
Yeah, I saw that interview. Yeah, I saw that interview.
Yeah, so and it's because you have very different reasons for why they're concluding that Jesus rose from the dead. So with Peter, something has to set off the apostles, and it's multiply attested. In other words, we have it in multiple places that Jesus appeared to Peter. something had to persuade the other apostles. And in our sources, we have the group appearances. That's even tougher for an atheist to grant, because if I see something, you could always say it's in my mind, or a vision or something like that. If a group of people see it, now you've got something else. So Ehrman doesn't grant the group appearances. He grants Peter, because something has to explain how the disciples concluded that Jesus had risen from the dead. Mary, he didn't explain why he believes it. I don't recall him explaining why he believes Mary in particular, but that would be, I'm guessing that would be another principle of embarrassment. Why is this woman introduced as a witness of the risen Jesus? It wouldn't have helped your case. So it just seems like there was, in the first century, a woman named Mary who's known for seeing Jesus. And then Paul, because he's an enemy, so he's not going to be persuaded by Peter. He would have hated Peter before he became a Christian. So how do you account for Paul's transformation? And so Ehrman grants the appearances to those three. And so that's the data that we have. I would say we have a lot. I would say we have a lot more data, but just going with that, just going with what an atheist critic of Christianity, who's been studying this most of his life, just going with the evidence there, what's the best explanation? And the thing is, if it's just a vision, it's really weird that it's happening to men and women, friends and foes. There were lots of people claiming to be the Messiah back in the day. If they died, that was it. Jesus just happens to be the guy who he dies, and then everyone starts concluding that he was appearing to them risen from the dead. So there's this idea that he's appearing to multiple sort of different kinds of people. And there's the issue that they're concluding that he's been raised from the dead, that he's been resurrected. Again, none of these people would have had a problem with seeing a vision. None of them would have had a problem with seeing a vision. None of them would have had a problem with the idea of their guy dying on the cross, and then God giving them a vision just to know that he's okay. Just for God to say, hey guys, I know your guy was crucified, but don't worry, he's here, he's all safe and sound. None of them would have had a problem with that. And that would have been very natural for them to interpret the evidence like that. In other words, you see Jesus, wow, I'm getting an awesome vision. Or if you did see him somehow after the crucifixion and he had survived, he would have been so horribly injured, they would have said, wow, he amazingly survived. Let's get him some medical help.
Yeah,
I'm just saying. So the takeaway here is we're looking for why resurrection became the position of the Christians. It had to be something pretty big that convinces them of resurrection, not vision or ghost or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, you packed in a lot. Let me try to respond to all of it in the time I have. So I got Bart Ehrman's book right here, How Jesus Became God. I really like this book. It's filled with good scholarship, et cetera, et cetera. I don't agree with everything. Now, I don't agree with everything Ehrman says. I'm Muslim, so obviously I don't agree with everything he says, given my theological views or my views of the supernatural, et cetera. So the position I've always held, again, is that Jesus was crucified, but he survived. Now, David Wood's saying, well, there's problems with it because of X, Y, Z. Now, well, Ehrman says in this book that How Jesus Became God, they had visions of Jesus. I think he proves this point really well, but we're trying to keep this short, so I don't have time. So I would just recommend getting this book, How Jesus Became God. It's a really good book, has really good views of scholarship, et cetera. So David Wood points out that how do we recall these appearances? Well, if you read Galatians 1, I believe Galatians 1, chapter 1, verses 11 to 12, Paul says, he got a revelation from Jesus. So that means that, and he saw Jesus the same way the disciples saw Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verses 1 to 8. It says Jesus appeared to the disciples, etc. So the question really arises: where is Paul getting his information from? He's not getting it from the disciples, and he's not getting it from he's not getting his information from the disciples. He's getting it from his visions or his own subjective revelations, because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians 1, that I did not receive the gospel from any man, nor was I taught it. That's an important part. Taught it. I received it by revelation. So Paul is getting his information about the death and resurrection, not from the disciples, but from his reading of the Old Testament and Revelations. He says this in 1 Corinthians 15, Galatians 1, etc. So again, we don't know what the disciples believe because that's contingent on the New Testament. And like I said, there are Christian scholars who say that the Gospels are anonymous. Raymond Brown says this, Craig L. Blomberg says this, et cetera, et cetera. So, you don't have any historical documents, reliable historical documents talking about Jesus' disciples believing that. And my view, like I said, is that according to the Q Gospel, Daniel A. Smith argues this, is that Jesus was crucified, taken down, and put in the tomb. And from the tomb, he was taken into heaven. That explains the empty tomb. And that explains why people like Paul had visions and Peter had visions, etc. Because you just cited Bart Ehrman, but Bart Ehrman says that there were visions. Jesus' disciples had visions of Jesus after the crucifixion. So Ehrman doesn't necessarily agree with your views. So that explains the empty tomb, because from the tomb he was taken into heaven, according to the Q Gospel. Because Jesus says, "You will not see me," et cetera, et cetera. So again, this claim is I don't think it's a good claim for the resurrection story, resurrection narratives, et cetera. So yeah, David, if you want to,
what's that book called?
How Jesus Became God.
No, the one you're talking about with the Q.
Daniel A. Smith, The Empty Tomb. I believe Shabir Ali cited that in his debate with you and Michael Kona. So after I read parts of that book, he talks about the Q Gospel, which again predates Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it talks about Jesus' disappearance and not his resurrection. So like Jesus says in, let me see if I can get it here. Jesus says in Matthew 23:29 and Luke chapter 13, verse 35, Jesus says, "You will not see me until the end of days." So Daniel A. Smith argues in his book, "The Post-Mortem Vindication of Jesus." And the Saints.
Read that title again for us.
The Post-Mortem Vindication of Jesus and the Saints Gospel Q by Daniel A. Smith.
What does post-mortem mean?
Death. But okay, I see what you're going. But,
yeah, he does not believe Jesus survived. That's the point.
So, yeah, but I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah. Here's a commentary on the Q document, which, by the way, we don't have. We don't have Q. We have quotations from Q, and Q is theoretical, whether it's an actual document or just oral sayings. But you find elements of Q. It basically occurs when something. Just for people who are new here, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and Luke were apparently familiar with Mark because sometimes they're quoting something and it sounds exactly like it was in Mark. So the idea is that they're familiar with Mark and they're getting this from Mark. But other times they have the same thing. Matthew and Luke have the same passage, but it's not in Mark. And so people have basically pieced together the material that is in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, where it looks like Matthew and Luke are drawing from a common source, and they call this Q. But it's sayings. It's not Jesus went around and did this and that. It's a collection of sayings. And so you're limited to kind of the things that Jesus is quoting. And so I'd be really interested in seeing what it is in Q, the sayings document, that somehow shows that Jesus didn't die, when the book of the guy who wrote the book it's about post-mortem. It's about what happened to Jesus post-mortem, so after death. So his position is not that Jesus miraculously survived crucifixion. That's how Shabir basically is striving for anything that kind of confirms his view. And so he goes to that and he takes something from that, and then he'll go to this German scholar and combine it with something that, and he'll Frankenstein together. He'll Frankenstein together a position.
Yeah, I mean, what is Daniel? Is he a Christian or atheist? I don't know. Is he a theist?
I don't know. Mike Lacona knows him from conferences. I'd never heard of him until Shabir brought him up.
Okay, so I don't know if he's a Christian or an atheist, but my point is, I've always held the view that Jesus survived the crucifixion. I've always held that, because when I looked at the evidence is very strong.
So you mean like you've always held the view that Jesus was put on the cross, but he survived?
yeah, that's the view I will always hold on to because that's the view I believe is historically certain. And I think William Lane Craig says it's virtually certain that Jesus was crucified and he was put in the empty tomb. And he has other points that I don't remember, but I remember he has 5 points. He says, well, Jesus was crucified. He was put in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, and the empty tomb, there was an empty tomb. So, my view was always that Jesus was crucified, but he survived because when I looked at the substitution theory, it doesn't make any sense because I think you said it best in other videos where why would Allah deceive the followers of Jesus into tricking somebody else? And it's a dishonorable thing. The substitution is a dishonorable thing because why would God miraculously disguise somebody to go on the cross? To me, it doesn't make any sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like it doesn't make any sense. And the other problem is the disciples believed that he was crucified, but we don't know if they believed that he died or survived or whatever, because, like I said, the Gospels are notoriously unreliable in this. So I believe Jesus was crucified. The substitution theory is a mess because it causes a lot of problems. So I agree with you that the substitution theory makes no sense whatsoever. And the Quran says it was made to appear to them. But I think Shabir Ali does have a good point. Because the Q Gospel talks about the disappearance. Now, I don't know what Daniel A. Smith's theological views are. I don't know if he's a Christian or an atheist. It seems like he's an atheist, but like you said, if he's an atheist, of course he's going to say the post-mortem vindication because, he doesn't believe in supernatural because if a man lived 2,000 years ago, is crucified, like I said, they're going to conclude that he died. But as a theist, you and me are theists. We believe in supernatural. We believe in miracles. So why can't God keep Jesus alive? But Dieter Zeller argues that Jesus was taken alive from the tomb into heaven. The German scholar, again, I don't know.
Yeah, that's what Shabir Ali does. I can't even find a source by this guy. These are the ongoing problems that, and I just want to say, Ehteshaam, this is a problem I see with. So you take Shabir Ali. So he has a position, and then it's not. Let me just look at this and go where the evidence points. It's like he has a prior commitment to Islam, so he has to defend that view. But like you, he rejects the standard view, and it's like he goes out and looks for stuff to kind of Frankenstein together a case for it. But again, he'll cite this guy in his book about what happened to Jesus post-mortem and so on, and say, see, if we take what this guy says about the Q source and we combine it with this German scholar and so on, we do this, and it's like, that's the actual case of the evidence is no one has had any clue what's happened for 2,000 years until we get to this guy who agrees that Jesus died, but you're going to combine it with this German scholar that we can't find anything from and so on and kind of piece together and say, see, this makes sense. Well, no, that kind of doesn't make sense. But I mean, just even think of the method of trying to do that. We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We've got Paul. We've got the second generation of Christian writers. And by the way, you're saying, the references. We don't have references to the martyrdoms. Clement of Rome is first century. He refers to the martyrdoms of both Peter and Paul. And these are guys. Some of these guys are guys who actually knew the original apostles. So we have a pretty darn good idea of we have an unbroken chain going back to the apostles. Even if you wanted to reject.
I think William Lane Craig, if I can interject, William Lane Craig and Mike Licona I believe it was Mike Licona or William Lane Craig, I don't remember, but one of these Christian apologists said that those are late legendary stories. Because if you read the New Testament,
what you have is, so if you go to like Fox's Book of Martyrs, it lists how all the apostles died, lists their deaths. What you can actually say is that some of those cases are based on very late sources, like 3rd century and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Peter and Paul, not the case. That's based on early, and that's why people across the board will grant that. That's why I'm assuming Bart Ehrman would grant the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, and that probably has something to do with why he believes they were convinced that Jesus had appeared to them. So anyway, the point of some of these sources being late, and Sean McDowell has a big book on this where he goes through all those sources and sort of rates them. It's like, okay, this is a 1st century source. This looks good. This is from a guy who's in a very good position to know what happened. This on this apostle, that's a 3rd century source. It's always possible that this person was familiar with some tradition and it's accurate, but you can't put a lot of confidence in it. Point is, it's kind of a mixture. It's kind of a mixture. But anyway, the point is, we know what the early Christians believe. The early Christians go out and they spread a church, and there's a church, and they spread Christianity. They spread Christianity in Europe, in the Middle East, across northern Africa, and so on. We know that these guys were proclaiming Jesus' death and resurrection. These things were always foundational to Christianity, and we can obviously continue this. I did want to address the point of Paul. You were bringing up that Paul. You quoted.
Yeah, if I can.
You quoted Galatians.
Yeah, if I can interject, like.
Let me go through some of these super chats real quick. Then you can respond. Then you can interject to what I just said, and then we'll go to the passages you brought up from Paul, just so everyone knows what we're talking about here. And I'll mention why I disagree with what you just said. Let's see, guys. Where did the name Isa come from? Syriac? You have any theories on that?
Well, Isa it means Jesus in Arabic, and yeah, I mean, I like the Quran, it was revealed in Arabic, so of course it's going to translate these Greek words like Jesus, John, Zechariah, Noah, all these Hebrew and Greek names. Of course, they're going to translate it into Arabic. I think that just what people were calling Jesus in 6th century Arabia, and the Quran just is using that terminology. Like the New Testament is written in Greek, but we know Jesus' disciples and Jesus spoke Aramaic. So if you want to argue there's a language problem with there's a language problem with the New Testament too, because the New Testament was written in Greek. Yeah, Jesus' disciples spoke in Aramaic, so you got the same problem with the New Testament.
Well, so the issue for people who are bringing this up is that the Arabic for Jesus' Hebrew name is actually Yasu, and he's not called that; he's called Isa. And so there's a question of where the name came from. So the theories are one, that it's actually a transliteration from the Greek name, which is Iesus, and then it goes through Syriac, and then it goes into Arabic. That way, I've even seen some people maintain that this is actually an insult, because Isa would be the Arabic version of Esau. And so Esau would be an insult. If Jews called someone Esau, that's you're the enemy of the Jews and so on. So there's a theory about that. But the idea is that at the end of the day, no one knows. People don't know. It's just, hey, here's this name. It's Isa. If it was the Arabic version of Jesus' Hebrew name, then it would have been Yasu, but it's Isa. And so the question is, why is that? And there have been Muslim scholars who just said, we believe that's like the special name from Allah for Jesus.
Well, yeah, my personal view is I just say Jesus. I just say Noah, Abraham. I just use their biblical names when I'm talking about these issues. Like in my videos, I don't say Isa, Ibrahim. I say Abraham, Jesus, John the Baptist. So I don't have any problem saying those English names. There's Muslims have problems with it. That's not me.
Yeah.
I use English.
We have Happy Easter, I Love Jesus, Happy Resurrection Day, Persian in Holland, reading on Christianity. Any books apart from the Bible you advise me to read, kind of reconsidering Islam? Thank you. So Persian in Holland, reading on Christianity. Any books apart from the Bible you advise me to read, kind of reconsidering Islam? I don't know if that means you're like considering rejecting Islam or considering it like you're going to believe it. I don't know what you're talking about there. What are your recommendations, Ehteshaam?
What was the question? What books you recommend?
What this person's apparently studying Christianity and Islam. What would you recommend?
Oh, anything by Bart Ehrman, Raymond Brown. Raymond Brown wrote Introduction to the New Testament. That's a really good book. I learned a lot from it. Raymond Brown, Bart Ehrman, of course. I know he's an atheist. I have this Bible right here. I got this book, this Bible, the Archaeological Study Bible. It's a really good book. Actually, a Catholic priest gave me that gave me that Bible, and I really like that Bible because back in the day I wasn't religious. Like when I went to university, that's when I became religious. Like in high school, I didn't care about religion. Like I was collecting Spider-Man books and Batman books. I was like into like video games, and I played some sports, and I played tennis. I did not care about religion, actually. Like a Catholic priest actually got me back into religion when I went to university. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting that people leave Islam and become Christians, but it's actually because of Christians, but it was actually a Catholic priest that got me into Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a strange thing. Yeah, I would recommend if you go to my YouTube, I have a bunch of books, some book recommendations. I would avoid Ibn Asaq, the history of Al-Tabari and stuff like that. But yeah, anything by Raymond Brown, Bart de Ehrman, William Lane Craig is good at refuting atheism. I think he's really good at refuting atheism. I've been reading some stuff by Frank Turek. Do you know Frank Turek, David?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been reading some of his stuff. He's really good at refuting atheism. I don't agree with his theological views, but Frank Turek wrote a book. What is it called? Why I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Is that the book?
Yeah.
Is that the book, David?
That's Frank.
Yeah, that's Frank. And yeah, I would recommend those guys. And I would recommend reading who's that Muslim scholar? Who's that Muslim scholar I was just reading? Tariq Ramadan. Tariq Ramadan, yeah.
All right. So, and yeah, Persian and Holland, not sure what you're kind of looking towards. As Ehteshaam was pointing out, if you're talking about like the existence of God, you've got William Lane Craig and Frank Turek there. I would, since you're studying Christianity and Islam, I would get the book Answering Islam by Norm Geisler and Abdul Salib, because they're also building a case for Christianity in there. So if you wanted an idea of a Christian perspective on those issues. But yeah, people can also make recommendations in the chat as far as what books our Persian and Holland friend would help them out.
I would avoid Robert Spencer.
Not me. Well, if you want the history of jihad, Robert Spencer is an awesome source.
No, I disagree.
Dustin says, you believe Jesus was saved, absolute death sentence, but not a miraculous birth. He created us in his image, but can't take a form similar to his own. Actually, Muslims and Christians agree on the miraculous birth of Jesus, so not an issue of dispute. Daniel Patrick, hey, salam, brother Gulam. Watched Imam Mikhail al-Ribar pronounce takfir on you during today's sermon. What? You got takfired today?
What is that? What? Why would I get? Well, I am pretty controversial. Me and Shabir Ali were pretty controversial, So I don't know. I mean, you can't please everybody, right? Like yeah.
That's pretty harsh. He's takfiring you, man.
Nah, I don't know why. I mean, I'm Muslim, Sunni Muslim. I don't, just because I don't agree with certain things that people say, that doesn't mean I'm a bad, like me and Adnan Rashid. Adnan Rashid, like we have our disagreements. Like Adnan Rashid believes in the substitution theory. Mm-hmm. I don't agree with him. But we get along. Me and Adnan Rashid, we get along. I've known him for a while. Me and Ijaz, we get along. I don't know any Muslim. Why would Muslim apologists have any kind of I don't know. I mean, I don't get along with every Muslim apologist, but I try to be friendly with everybody.
Well, it's too late now because you've been takfired by that guy. I don't know who that is, but
yeah, well, I'm going to takfir you back
in your face. Hussein Mashni here. David, don't forget about Stephen's death in Acts. Yeah, in the book of Acts, you have Stephen's death, and then you have James is also executed in Acts. So anyway,
but Acts doesn't say why they were martyred or what they believed when they were martyred. I read the book of Acts. It just says they were martyred. It doesn't say they believed in Jesus' death when they were martyred and stuff like that. So it doesn't, like New Testament does not.
You think the book of Acts is not clear on them believing that Jesus died by crucifixion? Because they only say it like 487 million times.
No, no, like Stephen, the book of the only martyrdom in the New Testament is Stephen, but Stephen, like we don't know why he was killed. Like he wasn't killed for his belief that Jesus died on the cross.
He
Uh,
absolutely was. He gives a full sermon, and they flip out and stone him for it.
yeah, but that's just Stephen. What about Peter? What about like nowhere in the New Testament does it say Peter, was crucified upside down. Thomas was martyred in India. These come from later legendary
Yeah,
sources.
again, some of our sources are first century source. Like here's what I don't get. If you've got the Gospels, and you've got the letters, and suppose you want to be skeptical about them and say, we don't know who wrote these guys, we can't trust these guys. Okay, you have the next generation who knew these guys, and they're saying what they believe, and we go, we can't trust these guys. And what that really means is we're just not going to trust anyone who disagrees with what we believe. That methodology is completely open to people, but I mean, be consistent. If we want to apply that methodology, I could say, well, I have no idea what Muhammad believed. I have no idea what Muhammad believed because our earliest biographical source is Ibn Ishaq, which you said you don't trust. That's more than a century later. So where are we going? We going to Bukhari? That's 2 centuries later. This would be like us quoting. So we just agreed that if you have a 3rd century source on someone being martyred, that we probably would be pretty skeptical about that. That's the situation we're in with the best sources on the life of Muhammad. So if we're going to be consistent, if you want to say, hey, you can't trust the 1st century sources, whether they're in the New Testament or outside the New Testament, you just have to get rid of all these. And you can't trust the 2nd century sources and the 3rd century sources. Fine, we could be that skeptical, but we should be consistent and be that skeptical of everything. And that's exactly what Muhammad Sven Kalish, he was a Muslim convert who became a Muslim scholar in Germany. And he just said, hey, these methods that I've been using dealing with the Old Testament and the New Testament, I'm going to apply these same methods to the Muslim sources now. And he concluded that Muhammad probably never existed. I disagree with him. I disagree with him on that because I'm not dialing up my skepticism like that. But if that's how we're going to do it, we're just going to say, we can't trust these 1st century sources. We can't trust the 2nd century sources, 3rd century sources. We can't trust any of the sources. We can't trust Paul. We can't trust Paul's interactions with other people. We can't trust the next generation who knew these guys. We can't trust any of these guys to explain what they believed. We can't trust modern scholars. We can't trust the atheist scholars where they're pointing these things out. We can't trust anyone. All right, then we just, I don't know. It seems like we just can't know history.
Yeah, I mean, just commenting on Islamic history, I would just recommend this book, Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature by Mustafa al-Azami. He talks about how there were earlier biographies than Ibn Ishaq, earlier Hadith than Bukhari, and Ibn Ishaq and Bukhari incorporated a lot of that earlier material. So the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down Hadith, and those were passed down from generation to generation. And Ibn Ishaq survived and Bukhari survived, but those earlier material that Abu Bakr, Umar, Khattab, Ali wrote, those hadith and those biographies that Ibn Abbas, they didn't survive. They were incorporated into Ibn Ishaq and Sahih al-Bukhari. But we're not talking about Islamic preservation stuff. But I would just recommend this book, Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature. But getting back to, the New Testament and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, I do agree that there is some truth in the New Testament. I'm not saying that it's all fictional and stuff like that. I'm just saying that this claim that the disciples believed it stems from the New Testament. And the New Testament, like I said, has been proven not to be historically accurate according to even Christian scholars. They're even saying Raymond Brown, Michael
No, the position would be that scholars would reject things that they have a reason to reject, but no one says, well, you just can't trust anything in this book. It just can't be trusted. That's a pretty fringe position. If you ask Bart Ehrman where you learn about Jesus, he says you go to the New Testament. That's what he says. That's where you go. Now, he'll be skeptical. He's not going to believe a source that says Jesus walked on water. He's going to be skeptical, especially about things like miracle claims. He's going to agree with you that people are making things up, but historians actually have methods for getting to, even if they're skeptical of books, right? Like I'm skeptical of a lot of Muslim sources. I believe you can actually get to true information using the tools of a historian. So they look and they say, okay, what's the earliest source here? Do we have multiple multiple testimony? In other words, is it just one source? If so, then it could be one guy made it up. If you have several sources, then okay, how did this get into several sources? And so then they start looking for independent sources. Like, is it five people, but they're all quoting the same person? In which case, it's actually goes back to one person. Or are they five separate independent sources? In which case, you've got a pretty good case. So they'll look at all these sources, and when they don't look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as these sources, they think of it in terms of like we were talking about with Q. So they'll have Mark. They'll treat Mark as a source. Anything that's in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, they call that Q. Those are sayings. And so you've got Mark as a source. You've got Q as a source. Then there's material in Matthew, but that isn't in the other Gospels, and they call that M. And then there's material that's in Luke that isn't anywhere else, and they call that L. And then they look at John, and then they've got Paul. And so they look at all of these, and these are independent sources. And so when you have something that's in Mark and it's in John, and we find it in Paul or something like that, if you have information that occurs in all of this, the question is, how did it get in all these independent separate sources? And just saying, well, so-and-so says that this gospel is anonymous doesn't really account for how this became just completely dominant, a dominant position in early Christianity.
Yeah, if I can comment on that, I think Paul's view shaped the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not the disciples. Because if you read the letters of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5, Paul says that he got into fights with the disciples, and the disciples were teaching a different Jesus. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5, that there were people preaching a different Jesus than what Paul was preaching. What was the Jesus Paul was preaching? Jesus, the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. So Paul is saying they're disciples, people preaching a different Jesus than what he's preaching, and that's the disciples or the disciples of the disciples. So the disciples.
So you're claiming that Paul was preaching a different Jesus from Peter and the apostles, right?
Yeah, that's what I think 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 45 is saying. Hey, I mean, we can have our disagreements, but that's
let's just go back, because you cited a couple sources. So you cited Galatians.
And I know
you cited Galatians. You said chapter 1, 11, and 12 there.
Yeah, and I know you don't like Richard Carrier, but I think Richard Carrier has a good point, because he says
the atheist Richard Carrier.
Yeah, it's Richard Carrier. I'm friends with him, and he had a good point. He said, well, Paul's view probably shaped the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the rest of the New Testament documents. Paul's view of
let's look at what Paul. Let's look at what Paul actually says here. So this is Galatians 1. He says, I want you to. So this is what you cited. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. The gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. And so the claim here is that Paul is just getting this information from his own head or from his own revelations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So if we keep reading, so he gives a little bit of a start. Matter of fact, let's just read it so everyone knows Paul's pretty quick read here. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. So I didn't instantly go up and consult human beings. I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem. To get acquainted with Cephas, that's Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. So Paul went and stayed with Peter for 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. So he saw Peter and James, the Lord's brother. He says, I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. Then I went to Syria and Cilicia. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report. The man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, and they praised God because of me. All right, then that instantly continues. This is just relevant just for what Paul is saying here. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation, so he's still getting revelations, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. As for those who are held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God shows no favoritism. They added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, that's Peter, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do all along. So, Ehteshaam, what I'm pointing out there is you go to Galatians 1 and you quote Paul saying, hey, I didn't get the gospel from other people. I got it from revelation. But notice what he does. After a while, he goes up and sees Peter and James. And then after another 14 years, he goes up and sees Peter, James, and John. And he says that there were people who were preaching a false gospel. So he goes up and he says that he presented what he's preaching. So he gets a gospel by revelation. He gets revelations, and in this case, it's about Gentiles not needing to be circumcised and so on. But he goes up to them and preaches to them the God, whatever revelations he'd had, and he says that it was to see if he had been running his race in vain. In other words, Paul is willing to go up to the apostles, to Peter, James, and John, and say to them, guys, this is what I got by revelation. But Paul is also a person who believes that Satan can masquerade as an angel of light. So for Paul, hey, if I have a way that I can test my revelations, I'm going to go test my revelations. So in other words, this would be like me. If I believe I got a revelation and it tells me that, it tells me about something that I can go investigate, well, it kind of makes sense to go and investigate it because then I can see if it's actually a correct revelation. But Paul says he did this. He says that there were people preaching a false message. So he goes up to Peter and James and John, says he laid out what he's been teaching, and they give him the right hand of fellowship. So it's Paul. He tests his revelations by asking Peter and James and John, hey, is this right? And they say, absolutely. Go preach that to the Gentiles. We'll focus on the Jews. You focus on the Gentiles. There were other people who were preaching something else. So I'm just pointing this out because when you go to Corinthians or something like that, and you see that Paul's talking about false apostles and so on, he's not talking about Peter and James and John. He's talking about these other guys that people who are also rejected by Peter and James and John. Point being, to say that Paul is just making this up, and you're saying, hey, Paul's getting this from his own head or something like this, his own private revelations, and that he can be out, he could just be out in left field and maybe nothing he's saying is actually true. Paul himself says, I went up and tested it because I needed to know if these guys are going to agree with me. And he says they did agree with me. So you're quoting Galatians to show that Paul's just coming up with this himself. And Paul himself says, actually, Peter and James and John are in agreement with me.
Well, I disagree. Yeah, I disagree because notice what Paul says in Galatians 1:11-12. He says, I did not receive it by human origin. So what does that mean? It means that he's not getting his gospel from the disciples, Peter, James, John, etc. He's getting it from revelation. So Paul, I strongly believe that Paul made up Jesus' death and resurrection, and that view filtered into that colored or influenced the later New Testament documents, because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 5, he says, "For what I received, I passed on to you through the most important, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures." Now, notice what Paul is saying. He's saying he's getting that information from the Old Testament. But the hilarious thing is, when you read the Old Testament, it's not talking about any, crucified or dying Messiah. I know I saw your video before we went on about 10 reasons why Jesus died. You talk about Isaiah 53, but Jews, even Christian commentators, honest Christian commentators, are saying it's talking about the nation of Israel. So Isaiah 53 is talking about Israel.
It doesn't make any sense. The person, whoever it is referred to as he, and he dies for the nation of Israel. So how is Israel dying for the nation of Israel as a substitute for the nation of Israel?
Well, do you respect Jewish commentators and rabbis?
I know there are Jewish commentators who say that refers to the nation of Israel, but you have to do that. If you don't want to believe that some person died, which is what it sounds like, if you don't want to believe that some person died, you have to say it's talking about something else. And you do have that the nation of Israel is called a servant. So you have some basis for saying the servant is the nation of Israel. But this servant also, you're saying the nation of Israel died for the people of Israel. That makes no sense. It just doesn't make any sense. Which is why it's just an uncomfortable passage for lots of Jews. In fact, my friend Anthony Rogers, he has Jewish in-laws, and he read Isaiah 53 to them one day, and the response was, "Hey, quit reading the New Testament to us." He's like, "Wait, that's not the New Testament. That's the Old Testament."
Isn't he Italian or something? Oh, he has Jewish in-laws.
Well, yeah, his in-laws. So anyway, but no, I think you missed the point of what I was saying about Paul. So Paul gets an appearance of Jesus on the road to Damascus. So he believes that Jesus appeared to them. He believes that he gets revelations from Jesus periodically. And so you point out, hey, Paul says, hey, I didn't get this from someone. That's true. He didn't get that initial appearance from Jesus by hearing it from someone. But he says in the same book you cited, Galatians, he says he went up and met with Peter and James at the first meeting. Then 14 years later, so he's going around preaching. Then he says he went up again, and I laid out the gospel that I've been preaching to see if I've been running in vain. Meaning I'm going to the actual apostles of Jesus. I'm going to Jesus' original disciples, and I'm asking them, is what I am saying correct? So Paul does go to confirm that message, and they confirm it. They say, yes. So it isn't just Paul saying, hey, I got these revelations, and I can just run around the world with these revelations. As Paul said, hey, I received these revelations, and then I went and verified them with the original guys. And so what does that mean? If Paul has his revelations, and Paul is out preaching the gospel that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, and then he says, I'm going up to Jerusalem to meet with the original apostles to make sure that I haven't been led astray with any revelations. And they extend the right hand of fellowship, and they say, absolutely, go preach this among the Gentiles. That's the original apostles confirming the message of the apostle Paul that you said Paul's just coming up with this himself. If Paul just came up with a message himself and then he goes up to the apostles, they would have said, who is this guy? Get rid of him.
Yeah, but I disagree. I disagree with you, David. Respectfully, I disagree, because if you read 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, it says...
Wait, I thought, who wrote 2 Peter?
It's anonymous, even according to Christian scholars.
Okay, so why are you citing it? Paul's not anonymous.
No, I'm just saying that. Let me finish my point.
Okay.
2 Peter 1 verse 16 says, "We did not follow cleverly devised myths. We are eyewitness magistracy." So this was writing unknown Christians who were saying that Paul's version of Jesus was a myth.
Whoa! Wait, where does he mention Paul there, or Paul's version of Christianity, or the resurrection, or Jesus? They just say, "Hey, we were." Oh my goodness.
Let me finish my point.
I can pull it up.
1 verse 16. The Christians are saying that Paul's gospel is cleverly devised myth. So there are Christians saying that Paul's gospel is a myth. So Paul is the one.
Where is he talking about Paul there?
He's not talking. I'm just saying that's Paul's version beat out the disciples' version of Jesus, and there were Christians who were saying that it's a myth. Paul's gospel is a myth. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse
Is that
16.
what they're saying?
Yeah, that's what they're saying. That we did not follow cleverly devised myths.
All right. All right. We're going to take a look at this. We're going to take a look at this. Let me just pull these passages up. All right. So let's see what Peter says. Or if you want to say anonymous, whatever. It's not anonymous. It identifies himself as Simon Peter. If you want to say that's fake, that's interesting, because I have no idea why you would be quoting it. But let's go ahead, take a peek here.
No, my point is that.
What'd you say? Verse 16.
2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16. We did not follow cleverly devised myths.
Now let's see here. Everyone in the chat. Let's see if you read this as you can't trust the Apostle Paul and what he's talking about with Jesus, and we're contradicting that. What Paul's version is just cleverly devised fables or stories. Let's read what it actually says here. So 2 Peter 1, verse 16, for we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about what? The resurrection, or what? No, when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So what's it talking about when it refers to his majesty? He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, Son of the Father, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. When he says we weren't following cleverly devised stories, he's saying, hey, we didn't just hear a bunch of stuff. We didn't hear a bunch of stuff and then just pass it on and believe it. We're the eyewitnesses here. And what's he even talking about? He's talking about seeing Jesus at his transfiguration. This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased, and identifying him as the Son. Where are you getting that he's responding to Paul here? When he's clearly responding to people, hey, what do you believe in Jesus, man? You just believe a bunch of nonsense. He's saying, what are you talking about? We were there. We saw him glorified. We saw when the Father said, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased.
No, notice what 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 says. We did not follow cleverly devised myths. That means there were Christians, first generation or second generation, saying that Paul's gospel was
Why would you say this is Christians saying cleverly devised stories and not critics? If you walk out in the Roman Empire and you're preaching and you say, hey, everyone, you need to believe in Jesus, and someone, hey, I'm not believing those old fairy tales. And his response is, I didn't follow. These aren't stories. These aren't fairy tales. We're eyewitnesses of this. We're the ones who have actually seen him. What in the name of common sense are you talking about?
Yeah. Wait, hang on. Did I? Yeah. I mean, that's what I get, is that there were clever devised myths. That means there were Christians or disciples of the disciples saying that Paul's gospel is seen as a myth. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. And, they're trying to strike back at those Christians. So there were Christians. My point is,
I'm trying to understand where you're getting this from. Where are you getting the idea? Because think, if I'm preaching, or if you're preaching Islam, it would be very common for an atheist to say, come on, just believing a bunch of nonsense stories from 14 centuries ago, or Christian, you're just believing his nonsense stories from 2,000 years ago. Grow up. And then, so the apostles are going out preaching, and then people are saying, hey, this is just a bunch of fables. And the response here is, what are you talking about? These aren't stories. These aren't stories about Jesus. We were eyewitnesses.
Let me clarify my point. If you read, let's go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. Paul says there were disciples.
One more. Yeah, before we go back there, I just wanted to continue. Just one more slight issue. Just 2 chapters later, same exact book. Let's start at verse 15. Bear in mind that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote you with the wisdom that God gave him. He writes the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures, to their own destruction. So this is the same book you brought out, that you brought up. You cited this. You said, we don't know who wrote it, but we're going to trust them to say that this book is attacking the Apostle Paul and saying you can't trust Paul. Paul is the one who's preaching these fables. And the exact same book that you brought up, that you cited, calls him our dear brother Paul, and then says that some people distort what he says as they do the other scriptures. So it calls Paul's writings scripture. So Paul's writings are on the level of scripture, and Paul is our dear brother, and yet you're somehow reading chapter 1 as the author condemning Paul's view of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus. So how are you getting that from this?
Well, it goes back to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. Paul says there were other disciples or disciples of the disciples preaching a different Jesus than Peter. So 2 Peter came afterwards, right? So when they say cleverly devised myths, they're Christians who don't believe in Paul, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So the author of 2 Peter is trying to strike back, saying we did not follow cleverly devised myths. So people are already saying that Paul's gospel, Paul's version of Jesus, was seen as a myth, because according to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5, there were people preaching a different Jesus than what Paul was preaching. And the only people who were preaching Jesus were the disciples or the disciples of the disciples. So you got a problem with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4 to 5. If you're saying Paul's gospel lined up with the disciples, no, that's not what Paul says. That's not what 2 Peter is.
That's it. That's exactly what Paul, and by the way, this goes back to what we were reading from Galatians. Paul goes up to confirm his revelations with the apostles because there were other people in that early community who were saying that Paul is wrong. So Paul acknowledges that people were attacking his view of Jesus. He says the apostles, the actual apostles of Jesus, they confirmed his message. But Ehteshaam, this wasn't a disagreement. We know exactly what this is about because we have it all laid out. We have it all laid out. We have it in Paul's letters, and we have this in the book of Acts. I'm just saying, we know what this dispute was about. This dispute is not about whether Jesus died on the cross. The dispute is not about whether Jesus rose from the dead. The dispute in the first century that was among people who believed in Christ. These are people who believed in Jesus, and you're right. Some of the people who believed in Jesus rejected Paul. We know what this is based on. You had the early group, they're called the Judaizers. It's basically if you Ehteshaam, wanted to become a Christian, they say you have to become a Jew first. You have to become a Jew and then convert to Christianity. So you're bound by the Old Testament law. So the first step is people have to get circumcised. They have to become Jews, and then they also believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Paul's rejecting that, saying you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to be a Jew. And we find the exact same thing in the book of Acts that we find in Paul's letters, which is the apostles examined all this and they said, you know what, that's right. The Gentile believers do not need to become Jews and adhere to the Old Testament law. Even the Old Testament revelations, when they're being revealed, when the Torah is coming, this is for the children of Israel, the children of Israel, the children of Israel. These are the revelations for the children of Israel. So these revelations were part of a specific covenant. There were people in the first century who said, oh, if you're a Gentile and you want to get on board with Jesus, you have to also you have to enter into that covenant that was for the children of Israel. You have to be a part of that covenant too. And then you can believe in Jesus. Paul says, no, that's a different covenant. Jesus saying he brought a new covenant. Because there's a new covenant, you just enter into the new covenant. Why are you going back to the old covenant to join the new? It doesn't make any sense. That's the dispute between Paul and these other preachers. But guess what? The apostles, Peter, James, John, they're on Paul's side in all of this. They agree with Paul, and that's why this wins out.
No, I disagree. I respectfully disagree. I think because if you read Galatians 1, chapter 1, verse 6, it says there are people preaching a different gospel. So the disciples,
yes.
who believed in Jesus?
Have you read Galatians? The book explains itself. He's going off on people saying that you have to be circumcised to believe in Jesus.
I read the entire Bible twice. I read it twice. Okay.
Then you know what Galatians is about.
Yeah, but I'm saying there are people saying that there's a different gospel. Galatians chapter 1 verse 6, it says a different gospel. So who is preaching the gospel? The disciples, right? So Paul is saying these aren't minor doctrinal disputes. He's saying people are preaching a different
No,
gospel.
dude, these were not minor. This was I mean, ripping the church into different factions over the issue of whether Gentiles actually have to obey the commands of the Mosaic covenant. That was a huge issue. That was not a minor doctrinal issue. In fact, even what? Go ahead.
How do you explain Galatians chapter 1 verse 6?
Read Galatians. The entire thing is, guys, you don't have to be circumcised. In fact, Paul even goes off in Galatians. He says, I wish those people who are pestering you would go ahead and castrate themselves. He's saying, hey, if these guys who are talking to you, if these guys who are preaching to you, if they're preaching this other gospel to you, and he identifies it. He says if they're saying they're saying you have to be circumcised. So they're saying this is not. Oh, and by the way, they're saying Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. No one's saying that. They're saying you have to obey the commands of the Mosaic covenant. That's what the entire book of Galatians is about.
So why does Paul say my gospel in 1 Timothy and all that stuff? When he says my gospel, that's his God. That's not the disciples' gospel. It's his gospel. 1 Timothy, etc. So Paul says my gospel. That means it's his gospel, not the disciples' gospel. And you have the problem with 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4-5. People are preaching a different Jesus. Now
they were. There's a Jesus where you have to enter into the Mosaic covenant to be accepted by him. And Paul's saying that's not Jesus.
Paul's Jesus is the crucified and resurrected Jesus, and people are preaching a different Jesus.
A Jesus who wasn't crucified and didn't rise from the dead. Show us that Jesus anyway.
No, it's the Q God. That's what I'm saying. If we go back to the Q gospel,
there's nothing in Q about Jesus not dying and not rising from the dead.
Well, Daniel A. Smith will disagree with you in his book.
Daniel Smith believes that Jesus definitely died.
Yeah, because I don't know what his theological views are. Maybe he's an atheist, maybe he's a Christian. I don't know. But Dieter Ziller, again, if we were to
let's see that. That's what I mean. I'm not taking Shabir's word for an obscure German scholar. And I mean, keep in mind, Shabir's saying, hey, an obscure German scholar that you've never heard of before, and that I can't produce right now. He says this, and we're all just supposed to accept it. Like Shabir, one, show us who this guy is. Two, show us what the argument is. And three, let's see if the argument is actually good. Because this guy is so far out in left field. If he says what Shabir says that he said, this guy's so far out in left field that we are seriously going to have to see if this guy has a good argument. I don't even know what the guy's argument is. All I know is Shabir says that the guy said something. That's not evidence.
I think I know what his argument is, because if you read the Old Testament, Elijah went up to heaven alive, Enoch. So he's basing it on the figures of Elijah and Enoch, because if you read the Old Testament, those figures went to heaven without dying. So I think that's where, and if you talk about the sign of Jonah, according to the Q gospel, I had nothing about the 3 days, 3 nights thing. The Q gospels talk about the sign of Jonah as
that does not sound like any German scholar. That does not sound like an argument. That what you're saying sounds like an argument that a Muslim apologist would use, not a German scholar. So again, this goes back to Shabir. Shabir, if you're putting this down as evidence, tell us what the guy's actual argument is. I would love to see it, because just saying, hey, some German guy, guess what? I could find a German guy who says anything. I mentioned Mohammed Sven Kalish. He was a convert to Judaism. I mean, a convert to Islam, became a Muslim scholar, Germany's first Muslim scholar. And he concluded that Muhammad didn't exist. Guess what? I can't simply say, well, this guy says Muhammad never existed, and therefore, you see, a German scholar says that Muhammad never existed. That's not evidence. That's not evidence. You'd have to say, what are his reasons? Do we accept those reasons? And as far as what his reasons were, I reject it. I'm not going to say, well, he's a German, therefore he's right. You definitely don't want to say someone's right just because they're a German. That would lead to some pretty disturbing global global catastrophes.
Well, I think I know where he's getting it from or his reading of the Old Testament. Elijah and Enoch were taken alive, so that's where he's coming from. That's where he's basing it off of. So
We'd have to see it, but that would make no sense. So God took certain people alive,
yeah, but
therefore other people who died were actually taken alive. You could say that about anything. So that
why can't
if that would be his argument, I would regard that argument as completely ridiculous, which is why I have more respect for even an unknown German scholar that I've never heard from apart from Shabir Ali, to think that he's probably got some better argument, but I'm guessing it's completely unpersuasive. Otherwise, you'd find the argument from someone else besides some obscure German scholar that no one's ever heard of.
No, I mean, I disagree. I disagree with what you're saying, but that's just me. But you still have the problem with the empty tomb. Nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead, so that explains the empty tomb. Because if God took Jesus from the tomb into heaven, that explains the empty tomb, right? So I believe
that would explain it. Yes, yes. So yeah, matter of fact, let me say where I agree, what your view would actually account for. So if Jesus, so you have the obvious problem. If a standard Muslim, a regular Muslim, says Jesus was never crucified, this by itself doesn't account for how people concluded that Jesus was crucified. So that's why they would need to say, God disguised someone. So that would raise issues. You wouldn't have that issue. So if Jesus is the one who's nailed to a cross, that accounts for why it was understood that Jesus was crucified. If Jesus survived the crucifixion, so if he survived, in other words, if he passes out, they think he's dead, they take him down from the cross, stick him in the tomb, and then God takes him up from there. You see, ordinary, classic swoon theory was meant to explain how the disciples concluded that Jesus had been raised from the dead. So the classic, not the, you have a modified view where it's actually theistic. There's something miraculous involved here. The classic swoon theory was just, Jesus passes out on the cross. They take him down from the cross. They stick him in a tomb. And then he wakes up later. And after he wakes up, the disciples, oh, wow, he rose from the dead. This is a miracle. That has problems, which your view doesn't have. So non-theistic swoon theory has the problem that if you saw a mangled crucifixion victim hobbling, you wouldn't have been able to walk, just crawling out of the tomb. You wouldn't have said, "Oh, wow, he's been resurrected." You wouldn't conclude that. If you say that Jesus was put in the tomb and then God took him from there, that would explain why people were convinced that Jesus was crucified. They're familiar with crucifixion, so that would explain why they believed that he died by crucifixion. And your view, which we could call theistic swoon theory, would account for why the tomb was empty. And so, yes, you can explain everything. You can explain everything like this. But the real issue there is a theological one, namely, well, there are two issues. There is one, how people came to believe that he'd been resurrected. If his body just disappeared, they wouldn't have concluded resurrected. You wouldn't conclude resurrection without believing that someone had physically been raised from the dead. But then the other issue is just theological, that if Allah does this and he knows that generations of Christians are going to conclude that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and that everyone of almost every background except for Islam is going to conclude that he died on the cross, then it's like, wait, Allah's doing something. It's miraculous. He's doing something miraculous. And almost everyone down through history is going to completely misunderstand it, including the vast majority of Muslims who adhere to substitution theory. So it's this weird situation where you and Shabir Ali and a few others are apparently the only people who understood what Allah was doing in all of history. And that's just, that's weird to me, but go ahead.
No, yeah. I understand. Look, I get why you want to hold on to Jesus' death in resurrection. As a theist, I understand why you, Mike Lacona, William Lane Craig want to hold on to Jesus' death. I get it. But there's nothing in the New Testament, Raymond Brown points out, there's nothing that killed Jesus on the cross. If you read Raymond Brown's book, Death of the Messiah, the 2-volume book, he says crucifixion pierced no vital organ. So it's very possible, according to Christian scholars themselves, they're admitting that nothing killed Jesus on the cross. Because if I'm crucified and, for 6 hours or 9 hours, I'm going to survive. There's no way I'm going to die. Right? You don't have to be Superman to.
You can die from the beating. I mean, you could die from just the beating, and you could die at any point during crucifixion.
Jesus survived the beating before the crucifixion. He survived. So people have survived far worse. I read a story about a Chinese man who was in World War II. They shot him with bullets, and he was still they shot many bullets on his back. He was still alive. So people survived far worse in ancient in history.
Yeah, but anyway, and some people die just from slashing your wrist doesn't pierce any vital organs. You still die from it from blood loss. And if you go through the scourging and the actual crucifixion, keep in mind you just have to get the right vein or the right artery in this entire process, and you're going to bleed out pretty quickly. You can do that by one little nick in the right spot.
We theists, but as a Muslim, I believe in the supernatural. My view is that Jesus was crucified. He was taken down from the cross, put in the tomb, and Allah raised, or God raised Jesus from the tomb into heaven. Then the disciples had visions of Jesus, as Mark chapter 16, verse 2 allows. Jesus came back in a different form. That means Jesus came back as a vision. Allah allowed Jesus' disciples to see a vision of Jesus. That explains why Jesus appeared to them after the crucifixion. So if Paul is making up the resurrection, we don't know what the disciples believe. I'm still going to hold on to that view. Now, I understand where you're coming from, David, that you want Christianity to be true. You and Michael Cohen and William Lane Craig. I understand where you're coming from. It's a theological view that Jesus died for your sins, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm saying, as a Muslim, as a theologian myself, I don't believe that Jesus was talking about his death and resurrection as salvation. As Bart Ehrman points out in his interview, I saw that interview, he says that Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John does not say, believe in my death and resurrection for your salvation. Jesus says, repent because the kingdom of God is at hand. You need to repent and believe and prepare for God's kingdom. In his interview with you, David, back in 2022 or whenever you did it. So I think Ehrman has a good point that there's no theological view for Jesus' resurrection other than what Paul was preaching. Paul,
what do you mean? I'm trying to understand what you're saying, because Jesus says that even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So he's giving his life as a ransom for many. So how is that not him tying his death to something else?
How come Ehrman didn't agree with you? He says that, in your interview, I'm pretty sure you remember that. He says, Jesus says, I don't believe in my death and resurrection for your salvation. Jesus says, repent because the kingdom of God is at hand. If you read the Gospel,
you were saying you don't see Jesus doing this. I'm saying you do, and you have it right there in the Gospel of Mark. If Bart Ehrman wants to reject that or say that it's made up later or something, that's fine. But you do find, my only point is you do find this in the Gospels. So you find it in Paul, you find it in the Gospels, you find it in the various letters, and you find it in the writings of the second generation. It's just, I mean, given this theory that Paul comes in there and just wreaks havoc and completely changes the message. I mean, I just want to explain how this really doesn't make sense to me. So you've got the original followers of Jesus. So Jesus has a community of followers and so on. You've got those guys. Then you've got Paul, and he's originally he's a Pharisaic Jew. And he's against Christianity because he regards it as heretical. So the question is going to be, if this isn't Jesus and he's not, if what the apostles are preaching is not Jesus is Lord, and it's not he died on the cross for sins and rose from the dead, I don't even know at this point what Paul's going to be outraged about with these guys. But he's outraged at something. We have no idea what it was. If your theory is correct, we have no idea what these guys were preaching. Just Paul was really, really mad about it. But then Paul has an encounter with Jesus. Paul has an encounter, and he receives revelations. He preaches. According to Galatians, he also went up and confirmed it with the apostles. We'll just leave that to the side. But the general gist here, when Paul starts preaching Jesus, his fellow Jews are really upset with him now. Now they're upset at the Apostle Paul. So here's the main issue. If Paul is not on the same page as the early Christian church, as the original Christians, Paul isn't on the same page with them, and he's preaching something radically different, completely different Jesus. And the Jews are mad at him. Then basically you've got the Jewish community. They can't stand the Apostle Paul because he's preaching Jesus is Lord and Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. So they wouldn't have been able to stand. They wouldn't have been able to take that. But neither would Jesus' followers. If Paul's going out and preaching some different Jesus, then the original followers of Jesus wouldn't have liked that. The Romans wouldn't have liked that. Paul's proclaiming Jesus as Lord and King. So this would have been Paul by himself, and everyone would have disagreed with him. Everyone.
Yeah,
the Jews would have disagreed with him. Jesus' followers would have disagreed with him. The Romans would have disagreed with him. Everyone would have disagreed with Paul. And what you're saying is that the Apostle Paul, completely on his own, in no man's land, just convinced the entire world to adopt the message that is now known as Christianity. That is the most, I mean, in a weird way, you're saying Paul is the most epic communicator of all time. He could literally have all the forces that existed in his time completely against him and still win. I mean, that's some dude.
Let me respond to that. Well, first of all, as a theologian and as a historian, that history is written by the victors. Right? Like Alexander the Great was a conqueror, and your book's written about him. And, because he was successful. Alexander the Great was successful in conquering, etc. So, David, that history is written by the victors, right? So Paul was the most successful missionary. I think you and Mike Lacona, etc., will agree with me that Paul was the most successful missionary. Like, who knows what happened to Peter and, all those other people. So the question really arises, why should we believe in Paul? He got into fights with the disciples. Listen to this. He got into fights with the disciples.
Over what?
The disciples weren't preaching like what he was preaching. And
which disciples?
Peter, none of those people, they didn't like him. They were saying he was preaching a different Jesus. But let me finish my point.
Where'd they say that?
Let me finish my point,
okay.
And then so basically, I think why Paul converted. I think this is a issue that I think Richard Carrier had a good point here. I know you don't like Richard Carrier. I know he doesn't like you, but we have to take into consideration what he says. He says Paul was feeling guilt. He was feeling guilt, and that's why he converted. It was a guilt hallucination or vision. That's why he got a vision from Jesus. So Paul wanted to be a leader instead of a persecutor. So these disciples who, according to the Gospels, the disciples are slow, dim-witted, they're illiterate, etc. Paul is the most educated. So of course he's going to overthrow the disciples. He's going to come up with his own death and resurrection for whatever reason, just to destroy Christianity from within or something. I don't know. And like I said, history is written by the victors. So Paul's gospel probably.
But he was the victor, though. Paul overpowered everyone. The Jews, the original followers of Jesus, everyone. Paul beat everyone. He was so absolutely amazing. He was such an amazing misleader and deceiver that he won against everyone. He absolutely overpowered everybody and won to the point where we have history has no recollection of some other Jesus who didn't die on the cross and didn't rise from the dead.
Yeah, Paul says, I'm crafty, I'm tricky. He says that in 1 Corinthians, etc. So Paul
Whoa. You're not reading that? Paul is one of the most sarcastic writers of all time. You're reading when he says, crafty fellow that I am. I caught you by trickery. You're interpreting him as this is the mastermind deceiver saying, ha, 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 I tricked you guys. That's your theory?
Yeah, my theory is.
Have you actually read that, by the way? Because Paul goes on this thing of all the stuff he's been through and all his credentials, and he said, "Yet crafty fellow I am, I caught you by trickery." You're taking that as, "Hey, let me give you my credentials here. Oh, by the way, I'm tricking you all." That's what deceivers do.
No, it's probably like
that's Paul. Paul is extremely sarcastic. Oh, crafty fellow that I'm. Like even in Galatians where he says, "Hey, those guys that want to circumcise, I wish they'd just go ahead and castrate themselves." Not saying he actually wants people to castrate themselves. He's saying, "Hey, if you believe that these Gentile believers can get closer to God through circumcision than they can through Jesus Christ, then why not just chop it all off? If chopping a little bit off is going to get you in good with God, imagine just chop it all off if you think that's what gets you in good with God." So we
could disagree as theists. We can disagree. I don't think Paul is I think Paul is early, but I don't think he's reliable. And my theory that I've always held on to is that Jesus was crucified, he survived, and he was taken down alive from the tomb. He was taken into heaven, and then
That
the
is, and
disciples.
just to clarify, that is, I do regard that as a superior position to the substitution theory, and I'm glad that in recent years I've seen more people sort of steering away from substitution theory. Looks like a big, just like a big insult to God
It
to me.
doesn't,
I don't know.
it doesn't make sense either. Like, why would God allow like, there's a story where like one of his younger disciples miraculously became Jesus and they crucified him. Like, why would God allow? Like, what's the point in doing that? Like, that doesn't make any to
Yeah,
me. That
you're right. And in some of those versions, it's actually insulting to Jesus too, because Jesus is like, oh, who's going to take my place here? Who's going to take my place? And someone's like, I'll take your place. He's like, oh, you good? You're taking my place. And so, yeah, God is a deceiver, and then Jesus is a coward who's scared to face crucifixion. So yeah, it's not a good look for anyone. So yeah, I agree that that's cool that
and
we're on the same page with that stuff.
notice how like nobody volunteers except like the little kid. As if
I'll do it. I want to get crucified. That's pretty rough.
It's a weird theory because it makes no sense, and it's a theory that I never like understood. It comes from the Gospel of Barnabas. Well, the Gospel of Barnabas is a fabrication. I believe it's a fabrication by some Italian Muslim. I think he wanted to like make up some stories.
That's good. That's good. We're on the same page there too, and it's we understand. I understand that Muslims and Christians can have different views and stuff, but yeah, no one should be relying on medieval forgery, like obvious forgeries and stuff. So yeah, it's good we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I remember my dad. He gave me a copy of the Gospel of Barnabas. He's like, "This is what happened to Jesus." So I read it. It was so. It even contradicts the Quran. Did you know that?
Yeah, Jesus denies that he's the Messiah, and there are all sorts of historical inaccuracies. He said, and then we sailed to Nazareth. Like Nazareth is in the middle of the land. There's no water that you're sailing. You can't sail to Nazareth, and so yeah, there are all sorts of problems.
My dad gave me a copy of the Gospel of Barnabas. He's like, "This is the true gospel." Then I went online and then I found Answering Islam's webpage. They ripped that gospel to shreds. Everyone was like, "No, it's not the gospel."
Yeah, and that's good because. Lots of people from every background tend to agree with whatever whatever someone from their side or a family member or something presents to them, and I have to stick to this because that's what my side does. So it is good that you're actually that you can look at these things critically and so on.
Yeah, so my dad was like, "Yeah, I told my dad about it, and my dad was like, just go do your homework. He didn't want to talk."
Smart. Let's take a few more super chats here. Sahih Muslim, Book 5, Hadith 2286, preservation. Yeah, that's where Abu Musa talks about, tells people to remember to recite the Quran so that they don't lose more chapters. How could the Savior die on the cross when he doesn't even have a physical body? That's a criticism of the Docetus and certain Gnostics and so on who believe that he didn't have a physical body. But yeah, that's not us. That's not me and Ehteshaam here.
Yeah, I agree. Jesus was crucified. I agree with that. I think that's historically certain. So if you want to nail the crucifixion on me, I agree with David Wood. Jesus was crucified. I think that's as certain as George Washington being the president, or Abraham Lincoln being the president, or Alexander the Great conquering, these lands. I think it's certain that Jesus was crucified. Where I disagree with David is the disciples' beliefs, the empty tomb, and the Q gospel, which predates Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which talks about Jesus' disappearance. Now, me and David can have our friendly disagreements, but that's just me,
If God can keep him alive after so much torture, why wouldn't he be able to raise him from the tomb? Romans 10:9. Now I'm going to assume, Ehteshaam, that you and I would both agree, of course, God can raise someone from the dead. So our agreement is not, and I would agree that God can miraculously sustain someone through crucifixion. So we both agree that God can do these things. Our disagreement is what God actually did. I believe God raised him from the dead, and you believe he sustained him.
Well, there's a major problem with the resurrection story, like I said, is that if you read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and this is the important part, is that if you read it, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. Nobody sees Jesus get resurrected. And the Gospel of Mark ended with the women going to the tomb and seeing an empty tomb. And I have this Bible right here. the Archaeological Study Bible. If you read this Bible, if you read what it talks about in the Gospel of Mark, the ending of the Gospel of Mark, there was a whole ending. The whole resurrection ending was tacked onto the Gospel of Mark. Why is this important? Because the Gospel of Mark is our earliest Gospel. It predates Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So that means the resurrection story was added in. It wasn't original.
No, that was the resurrection appearance. So Jesus appearing. Jesus rose even without the ending.
No, it ends with the empty tomb. It ends with the empty tomb.
But saying Jesus, he's not here. He's been raised, and he's going to appear. He's going to appear to you. But then it doesn't list the appearances, and you have different theories on why that is. Nabil's view. Nabil did his master's thesis at Oxford. Huh? Yeah. Nabil did his master's thesis at Oxford on this, and his view is that when Paul mentions the 500 witnesses of the risen Jesus, that these guys are going around preaching. These guys are going around preaching that Jesus appeared to them, and Nabil believed that the Gospel of Mark was written as the sort of background for. Because most of these people were not there for most of what Jesus did. But Jesus appeared to 500 people. And so Nabil's view was that the Gospel of Mark is written so that as the background for what these guys are preaching, and that the reason it doesn't give the appearances is because that's where you were supposed to fill in the appearance. That's where you're supposed to say, and then Jesus appeared to me, and here's why. Point is, we don't actually know why, but Jesus predicts his death and resurrection repeatedly in the Gospel of Mark. You have his death, then you have the resurrection. You're right. You don't have the appearances. You do have people who believe that the longer ending of Mark is authentic, and that in some early manuscripts, someone just had a copy where the last page like fell off or something like that. But yeah, that has nothing to do. You still have death and resurrection of Jesus in Mark, death and resurrection of Jesus in Matthew, death and resurrection of Jesus in Luke, death and resurrection of Jesus in John. What's that?
Are you talking about the passion predictions?
Yeah, when Jesus says he's going up to Jerusalem and he's going to die, and on the third day he's going to be raised to life.
Two problems I have with that. One is if you read, there's something called prophecy after the event. So I think it's prophecy after event.
It can be,
If Jesus did predict his death and resurrection, why in the Gospels the disciples are surprised when Jesus comes back? Is this because the disciples are slow and dim-witted, or because it was they didn't know about it? That's
well, the thing is, Jesus spoke in lots of parables and so on, and so again, they had no concept. They had no concept of a dying and rising Messiah. So if he says, "I'm going up to Jerusalem to die," you're going to be like, "Oh, what's he really mean by that?" And then what's happening? What the heck is going on? Wait, you were serious about that? You were serious? What the heck is going on here? So yeah, anyway, the point is, Jesus' death and resurrection is all over everything we've got. And so if there's some other Jesus who didn't die on the cross and didn't rise from the dead, we just have no record of it. And you'd have to say Paul is the all-time mastermind.
It goes back to the Q gospel, where I strongly believe that the Q gospel, the Q community, which predates Paul, was talking about Jesus' disappearance, and Paul was the one who made up the resurrection. So that's just me. Well, we can have disagreements.
Let's. I don't even know. What are you talking about there?
The Q gospel.
Yeah. What's the quotation?
It's Jesus says, "You will not see me," in Matthew chapter 23, verse 29, and Luke chapter 13, verse 35. Jesus says, "You will not see me." Daniel A. Smith wrote his dissertation or his thesis that it's talking the Q gospel, which I believe exists. You might have disagreements, but the Q gospel is talking about Jesus' disappearance, not his resurrection. So again,
all he says is, "You will not see me," which fits perfectly with the resurrection as well. So that would fit multiple theories. What you're saying is, here you have a passage which can be interpreted in two ways. We're going to sort of rip it out of the understanding of that in the Gospels. And
David, have you read that book, Daniel A. Smith, The Empty Tomb?
No, I started reading his book on the postmortem, the one you were talking about, the postmortem. What was Q? I forget what the title is. I've got it around here somewhere. I started reading it. It was not.
he talks like that's assumption language. That's not resurrection language. That's assumption language. Now, again, David, we can have our disagreements. We can have, but that's just my theory.
But he believed that Jesus died. So I'm wondering where he's getting where it's being
I don't
interpreted.
know. Maybe he's a Christian, maybe he's an atheist. I don't know, but I think the evidence shows that Jesus survived his crucifixion. Now, you and I, we can have our disagreements, David. That's fine. But as a Muslim, even if I wasn't a Muslim, let's say I became an atheist tomorrow, I would believe Jesus was still crucified. But I don't see any reason to believe that he died on the cross. That's just me. I don't know. Like we can have our disagreements, but that's just my view. I think
if someone was crucified, you would not think that's a reason to believe that the person died.
If I crucify you and you're on the cross for 6 hours, you're going to survive. No one's going to die. Like if you crucify me,
yes, you can. Again, if you can die just from the beating, and about a quarter of people did die just from the beating, and then they would nail those people to the cross anyway. But if you can die just from the beating, or you can die after a period of several days, and there are people who went 3 or 4 days being crucified. It kind of means that you can just die of blood loss at any point. At any point in the process. So to say someone wouldn't die after 6 hours when you could die after 1 hour, you could die beforehand, you could die after 1 hour, you could die after 10 hours, you could die after 3 days.
Yeah, then why in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 44, Pilate was surprised to hear Jesus already died? That means Pilate.
Yeah, because you do have lots of people who survive multiple days. That's true.
Yeah, so why can't God? So God was working as a theist.
People were surprised. People were surprised that Elvis died. Doesn't mean he didn't die.
No, but as a theist, you and I believe in the supernatural. I believe that God was working. God was supernaturally working through Jesus. So why can't God keep Jesus alive through the crucifixion? I don't. As a theist, you can't reject my view because my view is based on like the supernatural, the theology, the miracles.
Just to be clear, you're saying I can't reject a supernatural view. Like if I said right now that I'm not actually, hey everyone, I'm not actually talking to Ehteshaam. God is making everyone think that I'm talking to Ehteshaam, even though I'm not. That would be a supernatural claim. You couldn't reject that claim.
No, I'm saying you can't disprove my claim because your views are filtering through the lens of Paul and the New Testament writings. I'm saying they're not reliable. They're early, but they're not
given what you're saying, you can't disprove the substitution view either, because guess what? That would account for the evidence. But that would account for anything. Anyone can say God is tricking you into believing a bunch of stuff that didn't actually happen. In other words, if I've never existed and God has just the entire time people are seeing me, God has been tricking everyone into believing that I'm here. Guess what? You can't refute that. If I say I believe that God created everything 5 minutes ago and gave us false memories of our entire pasts, I can't disprove that. That's just the nature of unfalsifiable positions. Once you've put a divine source of something into the discussion in order to account for the data, no, you can't just say that it's 100% false that this couldn't happen because God could do this sort of thing. The question is, why would you believe that?
It's a theological view. As a Muslim, I believe in the Quran is the word of God. You might disagree with me, but I believe that the Quran is we have to do history when we're trying to make sense of what the Quran is talking about. As a historian, I consider myself a historian. I think it's certain there was an empty tomb and Jesus was crucified and Jesus appeared to his disciples. This fits 3 of 5 of William Lane Craig's points. William Lane Craig always brings up those 5 points.
Wait, just to clarify, I'm not criticizing here. You believe that Jesus appeared. So wait, I knew you believed in based on earlier discussion that we're having along the way here. You believe that Jesus was crucified in the sense of being nailed to the cross, but not crucified in the sense of dying by crucifixion. You believe he was put in a tomb that was later discovered empty, and you believe that Jesus appeared to his followers. And so you believe that this is a vision, or he actually was there?
Like a vision. I adhere to or I agree with the critics of like Bart Ehrman. He says that, well, Jesus came back as visions in his debates and his books, etc. So I believe that the disciples saw something because I believe Allah or God wanted to show that Jesus was okay. So he showed like a vision of Jesus to Peter, James, his earliest disciples. So if the disciples were going around saying Jesus is alive or Jesus was raised into heaven, maybe Paul misunderstood that and said Jesus was resurrected. I don't know. Like, you know, like we're dealing with probability. We're dealing with
And
like you and I.
no one clarified that for him.
No, because if God shows a vision to Peter, James, etc., and the disciples saying Jesus is alive, and if Paul is coming like years later and misunderstanding it to say Jesus is resurrected, that can happen, right? Because Paul, again, like I said, Paul was the most successful missionary. Again, David, I'm not trying to like mock your views or anything. I'm not trying to, you know, hammer my views onto you and stuff. Like, we can have our disagreements, but this is just my theory. Is that I strongly believe Jesus survived in the empty tomb. Allah, or God raised Jesus from the tomb into heaven. That explains the empty tomb. That as a theologian, that's what I believe. Now, you and I we can have our subjective disagreements, but that's just me. You know, I mean,
yeah,
I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm not disrespectful.
A little more clarification here, because your view does account for some of the for the big facts. So your view, as you've just laid it out, accounts for why people believed that Jesus was crucified, because on your view he was. Also accounts for the empty tomb and for the early disciples believing that Jesus had appeared to them. So here's the sort of follow-up issue along theological lines. So when Allah does two things here. Allah does two things, which, as it turns out, were massively misunderstood by literally billions of people, all the way down to the present. So, on your view, Allah miraculously sustained Jesus on the cross, but people thought that he died, so much so that Pilate is surprised that he died. So they think that he's dead. So that accounts for why people believe that Jesus died. So Allah does something, and he knows that people are going to misinterpret that as Jesus being dead. So that's one thing Allah does. The other thing that Allah does is he gives at least some of Jesus' followers an appearance of Jesus, let's say, to comfort them so that they know Jesus is okay. But that gets misunderstood by 2,000 years worth of people as Jesus appeared to them risen from the dead, because people also believe in Jesus' death. And so if Jesus is appearing, then he's risen from the dead. So the question is, when Allah miraculously sustains Jesus throughout the crucifixion, and then afterwards takes Jesus out of the tomb, so he takes Jesus out of the tomb, and then has Jesus appear to his followers. So that's three things. So question is, does Allah know that people are going to, the vast majority of people are going to completely misunderstand and misinterpret these facts? So Allah knows that people are going to misinterpret Jesus appearing to die as Jesus actually dying. He knows that they're going to misinterpret the empty tomb as Jesus has risen from the dead and left. And they're going to misinterpret the appearances of Jesus as he has risen from the dead and appeared to his followers as the resurrected Lord. So one, does Allah know that people are going to completely misunderstand these things, and that this is going to lead to the creation of Christianity and 2,000 years of Christianity? So does Allah know that people are going to misunderstand all of this to such an extent that no one knows about it until Shabir Ali and you and a couple others? Does Allah know that everyone's going to misunderstand all of that? And two, is he okay with doing things that the vast majority of people and all future generations of Christians are going to completely misunderstand? Is Allah doing things that he knows everyone's going to misunderstand? And two, did he know that that so many people are going to misunderstand what he did? And two, is he okay with people misunderstanding all of this and sort of starting Christianity as a religion in the process?
Well, like I said, like Paul, I believe that Paul made up the death and resurrection. Paul was the most successful Christian missionary or whatever. So
Hold on,
Paul
hold on, hold
was
on, hold on. Just, I'm just. This is just clarification. I'm not objecting to what you're saying. Um, you said that Pilate was surprised that Jesus was dead. Like, do you believe that actually happened? Because if so, then that means
no,
people are actually reporting
I
that
believe
Jesus was dead.
I believe Pontius Pilate crucified many people, and he knew from experience that in order to die, you need to be there for a few days. Like death by crucifixion typically took days. Jesus was on the cross, I believe, 6 or 9 hours. Don't quote me on that. Let's just say 6 hours for sake of argument. So Jesus would have certainly survived. Even Raymond Brown, in his book "Death of the Messiah," the two-volume book, he says crucifixion pierced no vital organ. So even Christian scholars are saying that nothing killed Jesus on the cross. So why,
No, no, no,
why?
no, no. So if I say you got shot 10 times and it didn't pierce any organs, but you bled out, that does not mean you didn't die. So yes, putting a nail through a wrist here and through your heel pierces no vital organs. The lashing doesn't pierce any vital organs, but you die from blood loss. You die from blood loss and shock and eventual heart failure. That's the point of people when they say, "Hey, you don't die from actually having your lungs destroyed or something like that." They're not saying, "Oh, therefore there's nothing that kills you." It's you don't die. You don't die in crucifixion from from organs being pierced. It's you die from blood loss and shock and things like that.
No, then it goes back to theological view that God supernaturally kept Jesus alive. So Paul was the most successful missionary, and history is written by the victors. So
Hang on.
that,
Yeah. Hang on. Yeah. Yeah. So what I was asking about that was if you're saying that Pilate was surprised that Jesus was dead, that means that people had reported to Pilate that Jesus was dead because Pilate is surprised by this. Now, it sounds like your view is that they thought he was dead, but that was just Allah had miraculously sustained him, so he kind of looks like he's kind of has the appearance of being dead, and then they stick his body in the tomb. But that would mean that Paul doesn't come up with the idea that Jesus died. Paul doesn't come up with that. That view was already there. That view was already there. That was standard. That like the people who were there thought that he died. So that's not something that Paul came up with. That's something that Allah made them believe by miraculously sustaining him, but giving him the appearance of someone who had died. So that view wouldn't come from Paul. That view would come from Allah.
no, because like humans have their own way of. There's this really good saying in the Quran. God is the best of planners. Quran chapter 3, verse 54, etc. So my point is that the disciples ran away from Jesus. They weren't eyewitnesses to what they didn't know what happened. And according to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 50, and Josephus himself saw 3 people crucified. One was taken down alive. So surviving the crucifixion is certainly possible, according to the ancient historian Josephus. So again, it goes back to a theological view. As a Christian, you have to believe Jesus died because it's a theological view. As a Muslim, I believe Jesus survived. It's a theological view. We can have our differences in theology, but I strongly believe that the evidence shows that we don't know what the disciples believed, and Paul was the one who was making things up, and he was the most successful missionary in his view. I agree that the New Testament says Jesus died and was resurrected. I agree with you on that. So if you want to keep pushing that on me, that the Gospels say Jesus died and was resurrected, I believe it. But the problem goes back to, are the New Testament documents reliable? No, they're not, according to your conservative scholars. And then we know where the stories came from. It came from Paul, not the disciples. The disciples didn't write down anything. So who knows what the disciples believed? You would have to prove that to me. I don't know how you could. It's like impossible to prove what the disciples were saying if you're just going by Paul, etc. So that's what I believe. Paul started Christianity, not Allah.
Um, yeah, yeah. I have to say, over the years, Muslims have exalted Paul almost to the level of a rogue deity with how powerful he was, right? I mean,
Yeah.
again, rejected. He would have been rejected by his fellow Jews. He would have been rejected by the disciples of Jesus, and yet completely overpowers everyone. Yet, in the at the same time, he's claiming to submit to their authority. Hey, whatever I'm preaching, I go up and I check to verify that what I'm saying is that they're on board with that. And then, of course, the next generation of Christians who knew the apostles, they think that Paul and Peter and all these guys are on the same page. So yeah, Paul, absolute mastermind. It's just weird that Allah knows this. He knows, hey, people are going to misinterpret this Jesus being nailed to the cross. They're going to misinterpret the empty tomb. They're going to misinterpret appearances, and it's going to start Christianity. And this apostle right here, this apostle is going to ease on into there and take over and completely corrupt everything and mislead everyone.
Well,
but it's theological, so I can't object to it. So.
No, maybe he was trying to destroy Christianity from within. I don't know. Like, I'm not, like, we can just work. I have to work with the information that I have, right? And Paul was the most successful missionary.
Why?
We know.
Quick question along those lines, because you didn't. You could have even with your view, you could have multiple views of Paul. You could say he's delusional or something. It's like with Muhammad. There are people who believe that Muhammad was deliberately deceiving people, and there are people who believe that no, he sincerely thought he was a prophet. He was just wrong. So I'm talking about the non-Muslim views, critical views. There are people who believe that Muhammad was deliberately deceiving people, and there are people who believe that he was sincere, but he was just wrong. So you can have the same view of Paul. You can say that Paul was deliberately misleading people. Or that Paul really thought he was an apostle and he was just wrong. But when you're saying that Paul came up with the idea of destroying Christianity from within, have you thought through that? Like, why would Paul want to do that? Because Paul's original objections to the Christian message was that it disagrees with Judaism. So why would he turn Christianity into this much bigger thing, which flies in the face of Judaism? If his objection to the preaching of Jesus is, this contradicts my view of Judaism, why would he then twist it into something that goes even further and then spread it around the world so that billions and billions of people are now on board with it? Because that's weird.
I don't know, but what my views are that the disciples, they were not successful in preaching whatever their version of Christianity was. Why Paul would go to these extreme lengths to, distort the message of Jesus, but like Paul contradicts the Gospels. Like Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 17 to 19, I believe, that follow the law, that I've not come to abolish the law but fulfill. Paul gets rid of the law. He says, the law is we're saved by the grace of God, or the crucifixion is the way to salvation, etc. So Paul already contradicts Jesus. Now, why Paul would make up this grand scheme to destroy Christianity from within, and why would he go through?
How did I was pulling up a passage? How did Paul contradict Jesus?
Like Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 17 to 19, I believe, Jesus said, "I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill." Jesus also says Scripture can't be broken in the Gospel of John, et cetera, et cetera. So Paul wants to get rid of the Old Testament and say, focus on the crucifixion of Jesus for sins, et cetera, et cetera. Jesus died for your sins.
But I thought the Gospels were inspired by Paul. So why would they contradict him?
Well, maybe they have like genuine teachings of Jesus on, like even like Bart Ehrman says, like, we have to go to the New Testament to learn about what Jesus says. So I agree with him there that that's the earliest record. So, I don't know, but there is a problem with Jesus contradicting Paul and Paul contradicting Jesus in the epistles versus the gospel. So you do have that problem as a theologian.
So if the Gospels say the same thing that Paul said, then that's because the Gospel authors were sort of brainwashed by Paul. And yet, if the Gospels disagree with Paul, then that shows that Paul was a false teacher and he's preaching something else.
Well, maybe the Gospel writers were getting different information from their communities or whatever. I don't know, but you do have the problem with Paul. Muslims don't accept Paul. I don't accept Paul because Paul's never mentioned in the Quran.
Early Muslims did. Um,
Like who? Isak? Like who? Ibn Isak?
yeah, Ibn Ishaq, I believe that's in Tabari. Yeah, they regarded him as someone who was not one of his original disciples, but who was sent. There have even been Muslim interpreters who believe that he was that the Quran refers to him when it talks about the witnesses being sent and so on. Um,
Well, he's not mentioned in the Hadith or the Quran explicitly. So if Ibn Isak is just writing, like I said, back in my debate with Sam Shamoun, I nailed this point that Ibn Ishaq was just writing down anything he heard from anybody. Same thing with Al-Tabari, et cetera. They weren't doing any fact checking. They were just writing down anything they heard. So if they got that information from Christians, if they're writing down Paul as a disciple, that's, they weren't doing any kind of fact checking. They were just writing down anything they heard from anybody. It's like me quoting like the Jesus seminar to you, or that Jesus didn't exist, or whatever. You'd be like, get out of here, where you're there's no evidence for that, or the evidence is strong for Jesus' existence, etc. So Paul, I mean, Ibn Ishaq was just writing down anything he heard from him.
yeah, so just so everyone knows, the Apostle Paul said that he that he upholds the law. He just it was that is not the law is not what gets you salvation. Salvation is through Jesus. As far as Jesus saying that he came not to abolish the law but to fulfill, the normal Christian interpretation of that doesn't conflict with the Apostle Paul. It's that Jesus is saying he fulfilled the law, just as it's like in the same sense of Jesus fulfilled a prophecy. Jesus fulfilled it. So Paul is saying something completely different there. He's talking about like what Gentiles need to believe, and the people who are saying the Gentiles need to adhere to the old covenant law. But let's go ahead and take some super chats. We have to close out here pretty soon. I do have something to do about
All right.
by 11. I have to be taking care of one of my sons here. So
Oh, okay.
let's zoom through some of these here. Theologically speaking, what is Allah's whole purpose with the widespread false religion of Christianity? D Wood can do the vice versa for Islam. So I guess this is talking about what I was bringing up. Like, if Allah is doing these things and he knows that this is going to lead to Christianity, then
You want me to answer?
yeah. Let's matter of fact, since we have a bunch of super chats, let's try and give kind of quickish answers. I don't know.
Okay, so wait, what I'm sorry, can you repeat the question real quick?
Yeah, it says, theologically speaking, what is Allah's whole purpose with the widespread false religion of Christianity? So I think this person is thinking how I was thinking, that if Allah knows what he's doing, and he knows that people are going to misunderstand the crucifixion as Jesus dying, and then people are going to misinterpret the appearances as Jesus having risen from the dead, and that this is going to lead to Christianity. What's the point if Allah knows he's doing that?
Yeah, like I said, history is written by the victors. The victors can be right, they can be wrong. In this case, Paul was wrong because we don't know. He wasn't getting his information from the disciples. I strongly believe he made up the whole death and resurrection. I strongly believe it. Now, as Christians can disagree with me, but I think the evidence is strong that Paul was notoriously unreliable when he's talking about the death and resurrection. But my point is that history is written by the victors, whether they're right or wrong. We know that Alexander the Great was a pagan, yet he still conquered the Jews, etc. Like why would the God of the Bible allow Alexander the Great to conquer, God believing Jews and stuff like that? It goes back to history is written by the victors. So Paul wanted to destroy. My theory is that Paul was feeling guilt and he wanted to be a leader instead of a persecutor. I agree with Richard Carrier on that. Maybe Paul wanted to do oppose the disciples, or maybe wanted to destroy Christianity from within by pretending to be a leader. I don't know. But the whole point is that maybe Christianity spread. The whole reason why Christianity spread is because of Paul. If it wasn't for Paul and if it wasn't for Constantine, David would not be a Christian. There would be no Christianity today if it wasn't for Paul and Constantine. Paul opened it up to the Gentiles, and Constantine made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. So history is written by the victors, right? So, why was Christianity successful and not, the cult of Apollonius of Tyana or something like that? Because of Constantine, right? Constantine was outlawing paganism, and he was forcing Christianity. He was looting pagan temples, and he was, forcing Christianity on people. Paul was the one who went to the Gentiles because Jesus' disciples were limited to the house of Israel, while Paul was taking it to, Europe, to the Middle East, to other places. So Paul is the victor here, not the disciples. The disciples were not successful in preaching their version. of Christianity. Paul was. So Paul was the one who was successful in it. Then it goes back to, like, why would God allow that? Well, maybe Paul was, I don't know, but maybe Paul was more successful, and Allah wanted to veil Islam until the coming of Prophet Muhammad, according to Al-Qurtubi's view. So that's just my theological theory.
Yeah, I did have a question along those lines, that the apostles were just not successful, and someone else came in who was more successful. So just wanted to get your view on. I'll just read two quick verses real quick from the Quran. So this is Surah 3, verse 55, which you actually mentioned earlier, because there's a word, mutawafika here. Ordinarily means it can refer to it refers to Allah taking away your soul, and can refer to sleep, or can refer to, if it's basically Allah can take your soul away. If he returns it, then you are asleep. If he doesn't return it, then you die. But that's not what I'm bringing it up for. So behold, God said, O Jesus, I will take thee and raise thee to myself, and clear thee of the falsehoods of those who blaspheme. I will make those who follow thee superior to those who reject faith, to the day of resurrection. Then shall ye all return unto me, and I will judge between you of the matters wherein ye dispute. So here, Allah says to Jesus, I'm gonna make those who follow you superior to those who reject faith. So Paul would be, on Ehteshaam's view, Paul would be one of the people who rejects faith, and Allah says that he's going to make Jesus' true followers superior to the day of resurrection, to those who reject faith. So that's 355. And then we want to get to 61:14. And let's see, I'll read Shakir here. O you who believe, be helpers in the cause of Allah. As Isa, son of Maryam, said to his disciples, who are my helpers in the cause of Allah? The disciples said, we are helpers in the cause of Allah. So a party of the children of Israel believed, and another party disbelieved. Paul would, of course, be among those who disbelieved. But Allah says, then we aided those who believed against their enemy, and they became uppermost. So Allah here says some of the children of Israel believed in Jesus, another party disbelieved. Allah says he aided the true believers, he aided them. He gave them supernatural assistance. He gave them supernatural aid. Allah helped them until they became. I just want the viewers to understand, because this might be new for them. So Allah says he aided the true followers of Jesus against their enemy until they became uppermost. But it sounds to me like Ehteshaam is saying these guys were weak. They couldn't get their message across. Their message faded out, and the Apostle Paul won. So according to 61:14, Allah helps the true followers of Jesus until they become uppermost over those who reject him. According to Ehteshaam's view, the false apostle is the one who becomes uppermost, and the real followers just sort of fade out because they're weak preachers and they can't get the job done, and apparently Allah didn't help them at all. So which one's right?
So yeah, I mean, if you read, going to Quran chapter 3, verse 55, it says that, if you read Tafsir ibn Kathir, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, etc., it said that Jesus was to be followed, that Jesus' followers were superior to the Jews, etc., because the Jews rejected Jesus and the Virgin Mary. They would say blasphemous things, according to the Talmud, etc., they'd say blasphemous things against Jesus and the Virgin Mary. So the Quran is basically saying is that the Christians are superior to the Jews and the Romans, the Roman pagans, etc., and until the coming of Islam. The Quran, chapter 61, verse 14, if you read Tafsir al-Qurtubi, it says that in Tafsir, al-Qurtubi is a early Muslim scholar. He wrote a commentary on the Quran, etc. It says that Allah had the religion of Islam veiled until the coming of Muhammad, but the Christians are superior because they follow Jesus. Jesus is a prophet according to Islam. So the Quran is saying that the Christians are superior because they believe in Jesus to the Roman pagans, the Hindus, the Jews, who all rejected Jesus at that time. So I think that's what the Quran is talking about. The Quran is saying that Christians are superior to Jews because the Jews reject Jesus, which is one of God's prophets. But the Christians are at least a little bit better because they accept Jesus. So they're superior to Jews because they believe in Allah's prophet, Jesus. So that's what the Quran's talking about. The Quran is not praising Paul or anything like that. It's just saying that, because the Christians try to follow the teachings of Jesus, whether successfully or unsuccessful, at least they believed in Jesus. So that makes them superior to Jews and Roman pagans and people who rejected Jesus at that time. So I think that's what the Quran's talking about. It's not confirming Paul, or it's not saying Paul's superior.
All right. Muslims have one source on this topic. Christians have the better sources. Muslims have one sketchy dude claiming to hear from an angel telling him what Allah said. This is tremendously problematic. Christian sources more likely. So if we were to flesh out this objection, it would kind of be, well, if you're just going to say the Apostle Paul, if you're just going to point a finger at the Apostle Paul and said, okay, Paul is responsible for all this, when Paul was in a position to actually be verified and confirmed by the people of that time, why wouldn't someone just say, okay, Muhammad comes way later. So if I'm going to say someone's making stuff up or getting delusions or something like that, why wouldn't I point a finger at Muhammad?
Okay, so it doesn't matter if the Quran came 600 years later or 6 million years later. The Quran says it's the word of God. How do we know that? The Quran's prophecies came through. We have, other ways of knowing that the Quran is divinely inspired, but we're not going to get into evidence for Islam in this discussion or this debate. The Quran, well, first of all, you're just going to the New Testament. That's what you're talking about, right? The New Testament. But I agree that the New Testament is early, but it's early and it's not reliable because, like I said, like I cited Raymond Brown, Craig L. Blomberg earlier in this discussion, that they say that the Gospels are anonymous. They're written by Greek authors, Greek-speaking authors. Jesus spoke Aramaic. That right there, that's a big problem right there, problem of translation, etc. So even Christian scholars are saying the Gospels are unreliable. So if you're saying, well, the New Testament's early, yeah, it's early, but it's not reliable. Just because something is early doesn't mean it's reliable. Just because Ibn Ishaq is early, that doesn't mean he's reliable. Same issue with Islam. I'm not saying Islam sources are vastly superior. Same issue. Ibn Ishaq is early. Yeah, it's early, but it's unreliable. As I've said, I don't know, like 200 times on my channel, I've explained why Ibn Ishaq is not reliable. So I agree that the New Testament is early and there's multiple sources, but it's not reliable because we don't know where it came from. We don't know what their sources were. So how can I trust the New Testament? Why am I going to put my salvation on the line believing these documents written by anonymous Greek authors who had no connection to Jesus? Why am I going to risk burning in hell believing in those documents? I even told this to David Wood. I'm willing to convert to Christianity if someone can prove that the Bible is historically reliable. The New Testament's historical. That hasn't happened, right? I'm still open to that, but that's why I'm putting my faith in God's book, which is the Quran. The Quran can be proven. The New Testament.
Ooh, the Quran that affirms that Christians have the gospel. We might. I don't know what your views are on that. We might have to save that for a discussion because that one would take a bit of time on what the Quran is actually. The Quran's position.
I can respond to that. The Quran's talking about the revealed gospel in Quran chapter 3, verse 3, Quran chapter 5, verse 46. It's not talking about like the New Testament.
Hey, let's have a separate live stream on that because.
No, let's do evidence for Islam. That's something I really want to do.
We could do that too. We could do that too. I'd be interested because I don't know what your arguments are. So yeah, we could do that.
It's prophecies and scientific accuracy. But like in the last discussion with Shamoun, I didn't get a chance to do it. But yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. So I got to be off here in about 12 more minutes. Let's just burn through some of these. Islam teaches, and I'm sorry for everyone who put in super chats that I didn't get to. I am on a time constraint today.
Well, if I'm talking too much, just cut me off.
No, it's fine. I'll just try and get through as many as I can before we have to close out. Islam teaches, and some of these we don't actually need to respond to.
Yeah, Islam, I gotta eat dinner and I gotta finish Spider-Man 2.
So we'll be off in about 10 or 11 minutes. Islam teaches to follow the straight path, and Jesus said he is the straight path. Stephen the Pelted is rolling in the grave, joking. Oh yeah, really funny to joke about people rolling in the grave. Big Rig says.
Wait, what did he say? What did he say? What
he said? He said. Well, yeah, I don't know because he's Stephen the Pelted and saying is rolling in the grave. I guess he's talking about Stephen. I don't know. Want to talk about trust? How do you trust a being that says they are the greatest deceiver? Do you not see the logical fallacy of saying you're the truth and the greatest deceiver at the same time? Does Muhammad have proof of a flying carpet? No, he didn't fly on a carpet. Look up the miracle of Nohad el-Shami from Lebanon and tell me Christ is not Lord. Not sure what that's referring to.
I don't know what that is either.
It makes sense the New Testament doesn't comment on Peter's death if he was still alive and contributing to it. Also, being internally anonymous doesn't mean we can't see who is unanimously credited externally. Yeah, so they're you have to throw out a lot of tradition from the second and third generations of Christians on the sources, but that'll be a topic for a different day. Carrier thinks Paul and Peter were on the same page about Jesus. Otherwise, Carrier can't argue that the first Christians in the Jerusalem church were worshiping a crucified angel. Yeah, I know Ehteshaam likes Carrier. I've never thought that Carrier was coherent, but yeah, we'll not be able to get through all of that.
Yeah, Richard Carrier doesn't like you, David.
Oh, really? I have no idea why. Tom here says, great beard. We don't know which beard you're talking about because there are two of us here. Unless you want to say it plural and say great beards, then we're good, both good.
If you're talking about comic fan, yeah, that's me.
David, you're being very nice to this guy, but he's dishonest, and you cannot have a respectful debate with a guy who's dishonest. Well, I mean, keep in mind, there are two issues. If someone says something you're disagreeing with, or something that you believe is wrong, you can believe that he's sincere but wrong, right? So I can believe that Ehteshaam is wrong, and I can disagree with him, but still believe that he's trying to be right, versus someone who's just like lying. So I would normally assume that someone is being sincere.
Is he a Christian or is he an atheist saying that? Is he a Christian?
No idea, but yeah, I usually don't judge people's motives until they reveal them. Like you can.
I've debated people who are dishonest. I've debated James White. He's dishonest. He's a liar. I've debated Sam Shamoun. He's a liar too. So I've debated
what you're saying right now. So I believe that you are wrong on a lot of things. Do you actually believe what you're saying?
Yeah, I believe. Okay. As a Muslim, I believe what I'm saying. Now me and David, we can have a disagreement. So you don't got to call me a liar. I mean, just because I have a different theological view. I mean, I think James White's a liar. You don't.
Hey, don't be attacking every other Christian in the world here. Paul's gospel is of hope. He was condemning God's chosen people to death. He changed his mind for some reason. Wake up, beloved. Ehteshaam is painfully dishonest. He's jumping around. Wait a minute, is that the same guy? No, that's a different guy. That's multiple people saying you're being dishonest.
Well, I mean, I don't know why are you going to James White when he's also dishonest? Why are you criticizing me and not your own?
Why are you attacking James White? These people are attacking you.
I don't like James White.
What's wrong with you? Why does everyone hate James White?
I don't like him.
Keep up the
liar. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, James not just so you know, James not crazy about me either. But keep up the great work, David. And for the Muslim, please reconsider your stance. See, now that's a nice response. You disagree with him? Hey, please reconsider.
That's more sincere.
Gabriel himself told Mary that Jesus Christ would be born to her. Even Muhammad would only have had such once. An adult Jesus must have been special. Oh, so I guess here's someone just pointing out, since in both Christianity and Islam, you have Gabriel doing announcements. It sounds like Jesus is somewhat important. Yes, I would agree that Jesus is important in both Christianity and Islam. Jesus was crucified for what reason? Actually,
what do you want me to answer? You're saying
this one's actually interesting. Jesus was crucified for what reason? So you agree that Jesus was crucified. Why do you believe that Jesus was crucified?
Why do I believe?
Yeah, I don't mean why you believe that there's historical evidence that Jesus was crucified. I mean, what do you think the motive was for the people who crucified Jesus?
Well, I mean, just read the Gospels. Read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus was, overthrowing the money in the temple. Jesus was obviously upsetting the Jews. et cetera, et cetera. And read the Gospel of John, et cetera. The Jews are always after Jesus. So yeah, there was a bunch of reasons why Jesus was crucified. I just don't believe he died because I believe God can protect. Like, why would God protect Elijah? Why would God allow Elijah to go to heaven without dying? Enoch without. Why can't God save Jesus? I'm not being dishonest here. I'm just me and David. We can have our theological disagreements. I don't agree with a lot of what David Wood says, but I'm not just going to say he's a liar, That's just my theological. I mean, I think Jesus was crucified, but I don't see any theological reason for it. I believe he survived. Just read the Gospels why Jesus was crucified. I agree with the Gospels that's the reason why he's crucified.
All right, got about 5 more minutes. Ehteshaam, how do you reconcile Ephesians 4:9, which states that Christ descended into the lower parts of the earth if he didn't die? I think I can answer for you. That comes from Paul, and you would think that Paul is wrong there. You wouldn't agree with Paul, right?
Yeah, but Paul's letters like contradict each other because Paul also says there's one God and one Lord in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, et cetera, et cetera. So, but yeah, I'm sorry, but go ahead.
And regarding what I just said, Jesus must have been holier than Muhammad and all other prophets. It would totally make sense to call him the Son of God. Then, so I think the idea there is Jesus is just really different from lots of other people, not only in Christianity, but also in Islam. But yeah, we'd have to save that for a future discussion if you actually wanted us to go through that. Just remember.
Do you want to address any of these?
What's that?
Do you want me to like?
I'm basically pulling them up, reading them, and then seeing if there's anything we can comment on for the next couple minutes before we have to sign out. So like this, just remember that demons feared Jesus and Muhammad feared the demons. Not something we really looking for stuff that's actually connected to the conversation. Some of these are, some of these are good points that would be interesting for discussion, just not when I have to sign out in a couple minutes. Let's see. Sounds like you're an Ahmadi. No, you're not. You're not an. You're not an Ahmadi.
Like
you just your position on this issue has some similarities with the Ahmadi position, but Ahmadis have additional.
Shabir Ali is not an Ahmadi. He believes in that Jesus was crucified but survived. It was made to appear to them does not mean somebody else was crucified instead of Jesus. Where are you getting that from? Even if you read the Arabic doesn't imply that. So me and Shabir can have our views based on the New Testament and not adhere to the Ahmadi thing. No, I'm not an Ahmadi. I'm a Sunni Muslim.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the position there is you can agree with an Ahmadi on some point. That doesn't mean that you believe in Mirza Ghulam Ahmed or something like that. Just like a Christian, just like I can agree with an Ahmadi on some point. It doesn't mean that I would be an Ahmadi. But yes, it is the position that you're maintaining as far as Jesus being crucified but surviving is much more common among Ahmadis than among Orthodox Muslims. But yeah, so the Quran at the end of the day, Surah 4 verse 157 does allow multiple interpretations. So,
exactly. So me and Shabir Ali, we're not Ahmadis. So.
Question for the Muslim theologian: why are you using known atheists such as Richard Carrier for your argument? Richard Carrier would also say Islam is a myth. Just give a heads up.
No, I'm just trying to illustrate a point that Richard Carrier does have some good points. Like David cites atheists in his videos too. He says, well, Bart Ehrman says this. Well, I could say the same thing. Why are you going to Bart Ehrman when Bart Ehrman doesn't believe that Jesus was resurrected and Jesus is, co-equal with God? I mean, like, why is David Wood going to Bart Ehrman when Bart Ehrman doesn't agree with his theological views? I'm going to Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman to just show that they don't believe in the supernatural. They don't believe, but I can take, if they have a good point, I can use it. Doesn't matter about their theological views. Like I think James White's a freak, but if he has like a good point, then I'm gonna use it to prove an argument. That just me. Not that I.
Why you gotta keep taking random shots at James White, man? What's wrong?
I don't like him. I don't like him. He's like, him and Shamoun are the worst. Literally, I'll never debate either of them again.
Let's see. What is this? Slippery loop? Hey, we're gonna skip this one.
Okay.
Let's see. How does any of this back and forth about what happened make Islam true or better in 2024? Clearly, we all prefer to live in a world that follows Jesus' words and values, including Muslim. Well, I mean, something that would make Islam true would be a different discussion. We're
Yeah.
discussing views of the crucifixion. But go ahead.
Yeah, if I can answer that, I'm just saying that the Quran's view, or the Quran chapter 4 verse 157, can be explained. Like, people like David Wood will say, well, that's just ridiculous, and atheists, they will say, well, or apostate prophet will say, well, the Quran's just wrong, and Bart Ehrman, they try to use. I remember, like, atheists tried to use Bart Ehrman to talk about the crucifixion, etc. So my point is that the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 is historically possible. So this is just my views, that the Quran is not wrong when it says it was made to appear to them and Allah raised them. So I'm giving my view based on the New Testament studies about what I think happened to Jesus and why that vindicates the Quran chapter 4 verse 157. As a theologian, I'm just giving my 2 cents here.
Yeah, and I have to say, even though I believe the Quran is wrong, as I mentioned earlier, and as I made an entire video on, I'm not actually convinced that the Quran is wrong in 4:157, because, I mean, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said that is a dumb historical blunder. Since hearing even from Muslims, and looking at how different Muslim interpreters have interpreted that over the centuries, yeah, I can't say that I'm convinced that the Quran is actually denying the crucifixion on there, and you do have some different views there. All right, guys, it's 11. I have to jump off right this second, but looks like I've got more to discuss with Ehteshaam, and so I'm sure we will. What's that?
I'm looking for evidence for Islam or deity, or some, like, Christianity, something like that. Some Islam or Christianity topic. What do you think, David? Evidence for Islam or something?
Yeah. Because, I mean, even there were even a couple of issues that came up. I'm really interested in the topic of what the Quran is actually saying about the Christian scripture. So I'm interested in that. Evidence for Islam, I'm always interested in, because I've just seen, like, some of the Dawa guys rejecting some of their traditional arguments now. So I'm wondering what the arguments are now. So yeah, we'll be having we'll be having future discussions with Ehteshaam. And notice, guys, we're pretty friendly. We're pretty friendly here. We're pretty friendly when we interact. And so just so everyone knows out there, we can all get along to have discussions. And again, if you'd like to see some of Ehteshaam's videos, go ahead and check the description box, and that'll take you over to his channel. So check out some of his stuff, and if you disagree with him, let him know why. And if you agree with him, then you agree. All right, Ehteshaam, thanks for joining and for this discussion.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and
I've been this topic for a while.
Yeah, no problem. And all right, gotta go. Catch y'all later.